I am Julius Holloway, 75 years old, and a man who spent his entire life building things from the ground up. I found out my daughter had changed her last name to her stepfather's name through a wedding invitation that arrived in my own mailbox. An invitation that completely erased my existence. I did not yell. I did not call her to beg for an explanation. I simply logged into the Harvard Law School payment portal, canceled her next tuition payment of $65,000, and waited. A few weeks later, they tried to drag me to court to force me to pay. Before I tell you how I legally dismantled their entire fake aristocratic empire and left them with nothing, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful person a very hard lesson about reality. It started on a regular Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta. The Georgia heat was thick and unforgiving, the kind of heat I had worked in for over 40 years running my construction company. I pulled my dusty pickup truck into the driveway of my home on Oakwood Avenue. It is a solid single-story brick house. I laid the foundation myself. I laid the bricks myself. It is not a mansion in the gated suburbs, but it is mine, and it has been paid off for 3 decades. I walked up to the old metal mailbox at the end of the driveway. Inside, mixed with the usual utility bills and hardware store flyers, was a thick cream-colored envelope. It was heavy. The kind of heavy that tells you the paper inside cost more than a decent meal. My name and address were written on the front in elaborate, sweeping black calligraphy. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of ice water, and slid my thumb under the seal. I pulled out the invitation. It was beautiful. Thick cardstock, shimmering with gold foil pressed into the edges. But it was the words printed in the center that made the air leave my lungs. It read, "Mr. and Mrs. Richard Kensington request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter Maya Kensington to Mr. Preston Vance." Maya Kensington. I read the name 3 times. My daughter. The little girl I taught to ride a bicycle on this very driveway. The girl whose skinned knees I bandaged. The girl I named Maya after my own grandmother. She was no longer Maya Holloway. She had taken the name of a man who had not spent a single dime to raise her. Richard Kensington, a man who wore tailored suits and called himself an investment banker, but mostly just spent the money my ex-wife took in our divorce. And right there, printed in gleaming gold letters, Richard and Vivian were presenting Maya to the world as their daughter. My name, Julius Holloway, the man who actually gave her life, the man who funded every single step of her journey, was nowhere to be found. I was just another guest on the mailing list. A weaker man might have crumpled the paper. A louder man might have thrown a glass at the wall or picked up the phone to scream until his throat bled. I did neither. I set the invitation down on the kitchen counter. I looked at my hands. They are old hands, scarred from decades of rebar and concrete knuckles swollen from early mornings in the freezing cold and late nights reviewing blueprints. Every callus on my palms was a sacrifice made so Maya would never have to struggle. My mind went to a very specific memory from exactly 3 weeks ago. I remembered sitting at my desk, entering my routing number and transferring exactly $65,000 to Harvard Law School. That was just for her fall semester. I had paid her undergraduate tuition in full. I had paid her rent in Boston. I had paid for the textbooks she complained were too expensive. I did it because that is what a father does. He builds a floor for his children so they can reach the ceiling. But Maya did not just stand on my shoulders. She stood on my shoulders, reached the top, and then erased the ladder. I did not feel sadness. The grief was there somewhere deep down, but it was instantly swallowed by a cold, quiet clarity. When someone tells you who they are, you believe them. Maya had told me she was a Kensington now, and Kensingtons do not need Holloway money. I left the kitchen and walked down the hall to my home office. The floorboards creaked under my boots, a familiar sound in a quiet house. I sat down in my worn leather desk chair and woke up my computer screen. The bright light filled the dim room. I opened the web browser. I typed in the web address for the university parent payment portal. The screen loaded, asking for my username and password. My fingers moved steadily across the keyboard. No hesitation. I logged in. The dashboard popped up showing a green checkmark next to the recent $65,000 payment. Right below it was the section for the upcoming spring semester and the automated payment plan I had set up years ago. It was designed to pull the money directly from my business account without me even having to think about it. It was a system built on absolute trust and unconditional love. I moved the mouse over to the account settings. I clicked on the billing profile. There was a small red button at the bottom of the screen that read Cancel Authorized Payments. I paused for just 1 second. I thought about the gold foil on that wedding invitation. I thought about the name Maya Kensington. Then I clicked the red button. A warning box popped up on the screen asking if I was sure, reminding me that missed deadlines would result in severe late fees and immediate academic suspension. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed. The automated payments were gone. I then went into the saved payment methods and deleted my bank account information completely. My financial tie to Maya was severed. It was done. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and looked out the window at the setting sun. I did not type an angry email. I did not send a guilt-tripping text message. I was simply going to let the consequences of her choices arrive right on her doorstep. I knew it would take about 4 weeks for the billing department to process the next cycle and realize the well had run dry. 4 weeks of silence. Let them plan their extravagant wedding. Let them toast to the Kensington family name. I was a patient man. I could wait for the storm to hit. I walked away from the kitchen counter, leaving that heavy, gold-foiled invitation lying next to the sink. The floorboards in the hallway groaned under my heavy work boots. I know every single creak of this house because I laid every plank of wood myself. I pushed open the door to my home office. It is not a fancy room. There are no mahogany bookshelves or leather-bound volumes. It smells of old blueprints, dried mud, and black coffee. I sat down heavily in my worn desk chair. My lower back throbbed instantly. It was a sharp, familiar ache, a daily reminder of 40 years spent pouring concrete, carrying lumber, and lifting steel beams. I reached for the mouse and woke up the computer monitor. The bright light filled the dim room, casting shadows against the walls. I opened the web browser and typed in the address for the Harvard Law School parent payment portal. My thick, calloused fingers moved over the keys with practiced ease. I had typed this web address so many times over the last 2 years that it was permanently committed to my muscle memory. The screen lit up with that deep crimson red. The prestigious shield of the university stared back at me. It was a place that felt a million miles away from the dusty, loud construction sites of Atlanta where I made my living. I looked at the welcome message on the top right corner of the screen. Welcome, Julius Holloway. It was bitterly funny to me how the university database still knew my name, even if my own daughter had decided to throw it away like a piece of trash. I clicked on the billing dashboard. The numbers loaded quickly on the screen. $65,000 for the fall semester. The due date was exactly 4 weeks from today. I took my hand off the mouse and closed my eyes for a long moment. The bright light of the monitor faded into the darkness behind my eyelids. I did not see the glowing screen anymore. I saw the past. I tasted the bitter, chalky grit of concrete dust in the back of my throat. I remembered the very early days of Holloway construction. It started with one rusty wheelbarrow, a shovel, and a stubborn refusal to stay poor. I used to wake up at 4 in the morning when the Georgia sky was still pitch black and the air was freezing cold. I would work until my hands bled and my muscles shook so hard I could barely steer my truck home. I breathed in toxic diesel fumes and itchy fiberglass insulation for decades, so my little girl could breathe the crisp, clean autumn air of a New England Ivy League campus. I remembered the day Maya was accepted into law school. She ran into this very office and hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. I promised her right then and there that she would never have to take out a single student loan. I told her I would build the foundation, and all she had to do was reach for the sky. And I kept that promise. Through economic recessions, through bad contractor disputes, through months where I ate cheap canned beans in my truck so I could send her a check for her expensive textbooks and her upscale Boston apartment. I never missed a single payment. Not once. I was the silent engine powering her entire life. I opened my eyes and looked back at the screen. The cursor was blinking steadily. She had taken that foundation I built, climbed to the very top of it, and then looked down at me with disgust. She wanted the prestige of the Kensington name. She wanted the polished, wealthy stepfather who played golf on Tuesday afternoons and drank aged scotch in exclusive country clubs. Richard Kensington never broke a sweat in his life. He never inhaled drywall dust. He never sacrificed a single hour of sleep for her. He just walked in, bought a tailored suit, and claimed the finished product. I moved the mouse. I navigated away from the main dashboard and clicked on the tab labeled Recurring Payments. The screen refreshed. There it was. My corporate platinum credit card ending in 4 digits that I knew by heart. The system was set up to automatically deduct the $65,000 on the 15th of next month. It was a machine of unconditional support running quietly in the background of her new elite life. I moved the cursor over the red button that read Cancel Authorization. For a fraction of a second, the image of my cell phone sitting on the edge of the desk caught my eye. The temptation was there. The burning urge to pick it up, dial her number, and demand an explanation. I could hear exactly how that conversation would go. She would make elegant excuses. She would say the name change was just for social appearances to please her new in-laws. She would cry fake tears and tell me I was overreacting. Or worse, she would use that condescending tone she recently developed and tell me I was embarrassing her. But I am 75 years old. I am a black man who built an empire from the dirt up in the American South. I have lived long enough to know that arguing with blatant disrespect is a losing battle. Anger is loud, but true power is completely silent. If she wanted to be Maya Kensington, she needed to understand what that actually meant in the real world. A name is not just a fancy signature on a gold-embossed wedding invitation. A name is an identity, and identities come with their own bank accounts. If Richard Kensington was her father now, then Richard Kensington could foot the bill. I did not pick up the phone. I did not type out a furious email. I took a deep, slow breath, steadying my hand on the mouse. I clicked the red button. A warning prompt popped up on the center of the screen. Are you sure you want to cancel this scheduled payment? This action cannot be undone and may result in academic suspension. I stared at the word suspension. Then I clicked confirm. The screen loaded for 2 long seconds. Then a bright green banner appeared at the top of the page. Authorization successfully canceled. But I was not done. Leaving the card on file was a risk. I clicked into the payment methods section. My credit card profile was still sitting there, saved for future manual payments. I hovered over the small trash can icon next to it. Delete payment method, yes. The profile vanished. The screen was completely wiped clean. Julius Holloway was officially erased from the Harvard Law School billing system, just like he was erased from that wedding invitation. I let go of the mouse and leaned back in my chair. The house was perfectly quiet. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the computer tower under the desk. I did not feel angry anymore. The heat in my chest had evaporated. I felt cold, calculated, and deeply calm. It was the same calm I felt before demolishing a condemned building. You step back, you check the explosives, and you wait for gravity to do its job. I knew exactly what would happen next. The university billing system would generate an invoice in 4 weeks. It would try to pull the money automatically. It would fail. An urgent automated email would be sent directly to Maya Kensington. Panic would set in. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy new life would crack right down the middle. I reached over and pressed the power button on the monitor. The screen went black and the room plunged into deep shadows. I sat in the dark for a long time, resting my calloused hands on my knees, listening to the heavy silence of the house. I did not need to chase her. I did not need to scream. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the consequences to arrive. 4 weeks passed. 28 days of absolute uninterrupted silence. I did not reach out to her, and she certainly did not reach out to me. I spent those 4 weeks doing exactly what I have done every single day for the last 40 years. I woke up at 4:30 in the morning, I drank my coffee black, I put on my steel-toed boots, and I drove my truck to the job site. We were framing a new commercial building on the east side of Atlanta. It was hard, unforgiving work. The summer heat was brutal, beating down on our backs and baking the clay earth until it cracked. The air smelled of hot tar sawdust and diesel fuel from the excavators. This is my world. This is the world that paid for the silk dresses and the expensive manicures and the Ivy League tuition. Every time I swung a hammer or reviewed a blueprint with my foreman, I thought about the sheer distance between my reality and hers. Maya was likely spending these weeks tasting catered cakes, selecting floral arrangements, and trying on dresses that cost more than my crew makes in a month. She was living in a bubble of luxury, completely unaware that the oxygen supply had been permanently cut off. I did not lose sleep over it. When you make a decision based on absolute truth, you do not suffer from regret. I slept like a rock every single night. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The sun was at its highest and most punishing point in the sky. We were in the middle of a massive concrete pour. The cement mixer trucks were lined up on the street, their huge drums spinning loudly. The noise was deafening. My crew was shouting over the roar of the engines, guiding the heavy chute to pour the thick gray sludge into the wooden forms we had built. I was standing near the edge of the foundation, watching the level, making sure the base of this new building was absolutely perfect. A building is only as strong as what lies beneath it. It was a fitting metaphor for my life right now. Suddenly, I felt a sharp, continuous buzzing against my leg. My cell phone was vibrating in the front pocket of my heavy denim work jeans. I ignored it at first. When you are pouring concrete, you do not stop for anything. Concrete waits for no man. But the buzzing stopped and then immediately started again. A double vibration, a text message, then another, then a third. I signaled to my foreman to keep an eye on the pour. I took a few steps back away from the noise of the trucks pulling off my heavy leather work gloves. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was smudged with dust and sweat. I wiped it clean with my thumb and pressed the side button to wake it up. There were 3 new text messages from Maya. The name flashed on the screen, just Maya, because I had never bothered to change it to her new chosen last name in my contacts. I stared at the screen for a moment before unlocking the phone. I knew exactly what the messages were going to say before I even opened them. The billing cycle had finally hit. I opened the conversation. The first message was short. It read, "Dad, my fall tuition is due tomorrow." The second message came 1 minute later. It read, "The bank says your card declined. What is going on?" The third message arrived just as I was reading the second. It read, "Fix it ASAP. I am at my dress fitting and I do not have time to deal with the registrar office today." I stood there in the Georgia heat, the roar of the cement mixers fading into the background. I read those 3 messages over and over again. I looked for a single word of warmth. I looked for a hello. I looked for a please. I looked for the slightest hint of awareness that we had not spoken in a month since she sent me that insulting wedding invitation. There was nothing. Just a cold, entitled demand from a stranger who only saw me as an endless ATM machine. Notice the absolute audacity of her words. Fix it ASAP. I am at my dress fitting. She was standing in some high-end bridal boutique draped in white silk surrounded by people fawning over her, and she expected the old man in the dirt to just push a button and make her $65,000 problem disappear. She expected me to fund the very life that she had actively excluded me from. She truly believed that my money was her birthright regardless of how she treated the man who earned it. I thought about the word ASAP, as soon as possible, as if her emergency was my responsibility, as if her lack of planning constituted a crisis for me. It is amazing how quickly children forget the value of $1 when they have never had to earn one themselves. I remembered when she was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. I used to bring her to the job sites on Saturday mornings. I wanted her to see what hard work looked like. I would give her a little yellow plastic hard hat and let her carry a tape measure. I wanted her to understand that the food on our table and the roof over our heads came from sweat and calluses. Somewhere along the line, that lesson was entirely lost. Maybe it was the expensive private high school I paid for. Maybe it was the influence of her mother Vivian, who always believed she deserved the finest things in life without ever lifting a finger to work for them. Vivian always looked down on my profession. She liked the money my company brought in, but she hated the dirt on my boots. When she left me for Richard Kensington, she traded a man who built things for a man who just bought things. And Maya had followed right in her footsteps, completely seduced by the illusion of effortless wealth. Standing there with the phone in my hand, I realized that I was not just cutting off a tuition payment. I was cutting off a toxic cycle. I was refusing to participate in my own humiliation. If Richard Kensington was the man she wanted to walk her down the aisle, if Richard Kensington was the name she wanted printed on her prestigious law degree, then Richard Kensington could figure out how to come up with $65,000 by tomorrow morning. I felt a tight knot form in my chest, but it was not sorrow. It was the absolute confirmation that I had made the right choice 4 weeks ago. If I had paid that bill, I would have been financing my own disrespect. I would have been teaching her that she could spit in my face, erase my name from her life, and still reach into my back pocket whenever she pleased. I tapped the reply box at the bottom of the screen. The keyboard popped up. I did not type out a long paragraph explaining my feelings. I did not mention the wedding invitation or the name change. I did not tell her how much it hurt to see another man listed as her father. I kept my response as brief and as cold as her demand. My rough thumb tapped the letters one by one. I typed, "Ask your stepfather. You made your decision." I read the 2 short sentences. They were perfectly clear. They left no room for misinterpretation, no room for negotiation, and no room for argument. I pressed send. The little green bubble popped up on the screen confirming the message had been delivered. But I knew Maya. I knew that the moment she read that message, she would erupt. The entitlement would instantly turn into rage. She would try to call me. She would scream, she would cry, she would threaten, and she would demand. I had absolutely zero interest in listening to a temper tantrum from a 26-year-old woman who wanted to play adult games without paying adult prices. I tapped on the little icon at the top right corner of her contact profile. A menu dropped down. I scrolled to the very bottom of the list. There was a red option that read, "Block this caller." I clicked it. A confirmation prompt appeared on the screen asking if I was sure I wanted to stop receiving calls and messages from this contact. I clicked confirm. Just like that, the digital door was slammed shut and locked from the inside. She was blocked. The silence that had lasted for 4 weeks was now a permanent, impenetrable wall. I put the phone back into my pocket. I picked up my thick leather work gloves and pulled them back onto my hands, flexing my stiff fingers. I turned around and walked back toward the construction site. The cement mixer was still roaring, pouring the heavy gray concrete into the earth. My foreman looked over at me and nodded, signaling that the pour was going smoothly. I nodded back. I felt completely grounded. The foundation was setting perfectly. Let the storm rage on their end. Let her stand in that bridal shop in her expensive dress and realize that the bank vault was permanently closed. The consequences had finally arrived, and I was not going to shelter her from the rain anymore. I picked up a shovel and got back to work. The sun began its slow and heavy descent over the city of Atlanta. I finished my shift at the commercial site on the east side. I watched my crew pack up the heavy machinery, the air thick with the smell of drying concrete and diesel exhaust. I climbed into the cab of my dusty pickup truck and drove the familiar route back to Oakwood Avenue. My muscles ached with that deep, familiar soreness that only comes from honest labor. It is a good kind of pain. It is the pain that tells you that you earned your place in the world today. I parked my truck in the driveway of my brick home. I walked inside, greeting the heavy silence that had filled the rooms for the past 4 weeks. I took a long, hot shower to scrub the gray clay and the toxic fiberglass dust from my skin. I stood under the scalding water and let it wash away the grime of the construction site. When I stepped out, I put on a clean pair of heavy denim jeans and a simple cotton flannel shirt. I walked barefoot into my kitchen. I took a dark ceramic mug from the cabinet and poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee from the pot I had set on a timer. The bitter, roasted smell filled the kitchen. I looked at the clock on the wall. It had been exactly 3 hours since I sent that single text message to Maya and permanently blocked her number. 3 hours since I told her to ask her stepfather for the $65,000 she demanded. I stood by the kitchen window holding the warm mug in my calloused hands, watching the quiet residential street outside. I knew the peace was temporary. I knew Maya. I knew that the moment my text message arrived, she would have thrown a massive panic attack in the middle of that expensive bridal boutique. She would have immediately called the men she now considered her real family to come and handle the broken ATM machine she used to call her father. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The dark liquid coated the back of my throat. That was when I heard it. It started as a high-pitched, aggressive whine echoing down the quiet suburban street. It was the sound of a luxury German engine being pushed far past the speed limit in a residential neighborhood. I watched through the glass as a sleek silver BMW 7 Series came tearing down Oakwood Avenue. The driver did not even bother to slow down appropriately as he approached my house. He jerked the steering wheel hard. The heavy luxury car took the turn into my driveway way too fast. The driver completely misjudged the angle of the narrow concrete path. The heavy front tire of the silver car violently hopped the curb. The rubber spun out of control and dug deep into my front lawn. That was St. Augustine grass out there. I planted that grass by seed almost 30 years ago. I spent decades watering it, weeding it by hand, and keeping it vibrant and green through the brutal Georgia summer droughts. And now I was watching the tires of a $100,000 vehicle tear deep, ugly brown mud trenches right through the center of my hard work. The car jerked to a sudden violent stop, leaving muddy tracks across the concrete. The engine was cut off. I did not flinch. I did not rush to the door. I just stood at the window and watched. The driver's side door flew open. Out stepped Richard Kensington. He was 65 years old, but he spent a small fortune on treatments trying to look like a man in his early 50s. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than the truck sitting in my driveway. His silver hair was perfectly styled, slicked back without a single strand out of place despite the humid afternoon heat. He looked exactly like the kind of man who had never changed a flat tire, never fixed a broken pipe, and never lifted anything heavier than a golf club in his entire life. He was a man with hands softer than a bank teller. He was the man my ex-wife Vivian had left me for because she preferred the illusion of wealth over the reality of hard work. The passenger door opened a second later. Out stepped Preston Vance. This was the man Maya was going to marry. He was 28 years old, born into a family with generations of old money and even older prejudices. He was wearing a crisp pastel polo shirt and pressed khaki slacks, looking like he had just stepped off a country club veranda. He had a permanent arrogant smirk stamped on his face. It was the exact facial expression worn by entitled boys who have never once been punched in the mouth for disrespecting their elders. They did not walk up my driveway like guests paying a visit. They marched up my driveway like an invading army arriving to collect a tax. Richard was red in the face, his jaw set incredibly tight. Preston was walking slightly ahead of him, puffing out his chest, clearly trying to look physically intimidating. I watched them approach from behind the glass. They looked completely absurd and out of place on my modest porch. They belonged in glass boardrooms and expensive steakhouses, not standing on the weathered concrete steps that I had poured with my own 2 hands. They reached the front door. They did not look for a doorbell. They did not knock politely. Preston raised his fist and began banging aggressively on the solid oak door. The heavy thud echoed through my quiet house. It was a violent, demanding knock. It was the knock of someone who truly believes they own the building and everyone standing inside of it. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I let them wait. The banging started again, even louder and more frantic this time. I could hear Richard shouting through the thick wood of the door, demanding that I open up immediately. I set my shoulders. I walked out of the kitchen, taking my time as I moved down the short hallway to the front entrance. I reached out with my free hand and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock clicked open with a solid metallic sound. I turned the handle and pulled the door wide open. I did not say a single word. I just stood there in the doorway, completely filling the frame. I am 75 years old, but I am still 6 feet and 2 inches tall. 40 years of hauling steel beams and pouring concrete keeps a man broad and grounded. I looked down at Preston Vance. He was at least 3 inches shorter than me, and despite his aggressive, puffed-up posture, I could tell there was absolutely no real physical weight behind his frame. He was all expensive clothes and empty confidence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. I think my absolute silence and my complete lack of agitation threw them entirely off balance. They had clearly prepared themselves for a screaming match. They expected to find a defensive, emotional, broken old man whining about a wedding invitation. Instead, they were suddenly standing face to face with a brick wall holding a cup of coffee. Preston was the first one to break the heavy silence. He stepped forward, intentionally invading my personal space on my own front porch, desperately trying to establish some sort of dominance over me. "Listen to me very carefully," Julius Preston said. His voice was dripping with absolute condescension. He spoke to me slowly, using the tone a frustrated teacher uses to scold a misbehaving child. "You need to stop acting like a petty, jealous old man right now. Maya is in the middle of her final dress fitting, and she is absolutely stressed out. She is in tears because the registrar office called her and said her tuition card declined. You are ruining what is supposed to be a beautiful milestone for her." I just stared down at him. I did not blink. He actually thought he had the authority to stand on my property and scold me. He continued talking, waving his manicured hand in my face dismissively. "I do not care what kind of little temper tantrum you are throwing about the wedding invitations," Preston sneered. "That is between you and your own personal insecurities. My family does not deal with the embarrassment of declined credit cards. You are going to go back inside your house right now. You are going to log into that university portal, and you are going to write the check for her tuition. We are not going to let your pathetic financial games jeopardize her legal education or the reputation of our wedding. So do the right thing, Julius, and stop embarrassing yourself." I listened to his words very carefully. I processed every single insult. Petty, temper tantrum, embarrassing yourself, pathetic. This 28-year-old boy who lived entirely off a massive trust fund that his grandfather had built was standing on my porch demanding the money that I bled for. He was demanding that I pay for the elite education of a woman who had just legally thrown my family name in the garbage. And he was doing it with the absolute blind conviction that I somehow owed it to them. He did not view me as a father. He did not view me as a man. He viewed me as a defective piece of financial machinery that simply needed to be kicked back into working order so they could continue funding their lavish lifestyle. I looked at Preston. Then I looked past him at Richard Kensington. Richard was standing a few feet back, his arms crossed over his expensive suit, looking incredibly smug. He was letting the young, arrogant boy do the dirty work of putting the poor black laborer back in his place. Then I looked past both of them, staring down at the deep, muddy tracks their luxury car had just aggressively carved into my pristine front lawn. I felt something bubbling up from deep inside my chest. It was not anger. I was far past the point of anger. It was not insult or sorrow. It was an overwhelming, powerful sense of dark, bitter amusement. The sheer audacity of these two men was so massive that it crossed the line into pure comedy. I started to laugh. It started as a low, deep rumble in the back of my throat. Then it grew. It pushed past my lips and turned into a loud, genuine, booming laugh that echoed loudly off the brick walls of my porch and rang out into the quiet suburban street. I stood there in my doorway holding my coffee, and I laughed right in Preston Vance's face. My laughter caught them completely off guard. Preston stepped back, his arrogant smirk melting into a look of genuine confusion. He looked at Richard silently, asking the older man what to do next. That is the thing about boys who rely on their father's money. When intimidation fails, they have absolutely no backup plan. They do not know how to fight a battle they cannot buy their way out of. Richard, however, did not step back. My laughter was the spark that ignited the gasoline. The mask of the calm, wealthy investment banker completely disintegrated right in front of my eyes. His face turned a deep, ugly shade of red. The veins in his neck bulged against the tight collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He pushed Preston roughly out of the way and stepped right up to the threshold of my front door. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Listen to me, you arrogant old fool!" Richard spat, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer control. "You think this is funny. You think you can just press a button and disrespect my family." I stopped laughing. I looked down at his finger, then back up to his eyes. "Your family," I repeated slowly. My voice was low and quiet, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "She was my daughter for 26 years before you ever bought her a handbag." Richard sneered. The ugliness inside of him bubbled up to the surface. He looked around my porch, his eyes scanning the cracked concrete steps, the simple brick walls, and the muddy tracks his own car had just dug into my lawn. He looked at it all with absolute disgust. "She is not your daughter anymore," Richard said, his voice dripping with venom. "And do you want to know why? Look around you, Julius. Look at this ghetto shack you live in. Look at your dirty boots and your rough hands. Maya is an intelligent, beautiful young woman who is about to marry into one of the most prominent families in the state. She changed her name because she was deeply ashamed of her low-class black roots. She was tired of being associated with a dirt-covered laborer who smells like diesel fuel. She wanted a real father, a father who could elevate her, not anchor her to the bottom of the social ladder." The words hung in the humid Georgia air. Low class. Ghetto shack. They were words designed to cut me down to the bone. They were the kind of words Vivian used to imply when she left me, but Richard was bold enough to say them out loud. He was trying to strip away my dignity. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to remember that in his eyes I was nothing more than the help, a beast of burden meant to pull the cart while he rode inside of it. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me bleed. I just took a slow sip of my black coffee. The dark roast tasted bitter on my tongue. "Is that right?" I asked calmly. "If my roots are so low class and if my money is so dirty, then why are you standing on my porch begging for it?" Richard's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would shatter. He was not begging, he was demanding, and my calmness was driving him insane. He reached his hand inside the breast pocket of his expensive navy blue suit jacket. He pulled out a thick piece of paper that had been folded into thirds. He unfolded it aggressively and held it up right in front of my face. The paper trembled in his shaking hand. "I am not begging for anything," Richard hissed. "I am here to collect what you legally owe. Do you recognize this document, Julius? Let me refresh your memory. This is the finalized divorce decree from the year 2010, signed by a superior court judge, signed by Vivian, and signed by you." I looked at the document. I knew exactly what it was. I remembered the day I signed it. I remembered sitting in a cold, sterile law office watching Vivian take half of the money I had spent my entire adult life earning. I remembered agreeing to every single term because I wanted to ensure that Maya would always be taken care of no matter who her mother decided to sleep with. Richard tapped his finger violently against a specific paragraph near the bottom of the page. "Let me read section 4, paragraph B for you," he said loudly, making sure Preston could hear every word. "It clearly states that the biological father, Julius Holloway, is legally mandated to cover 100% of all educational expenses, including tuition, housing, and necessary materials until the child officially graduates from her chosen program of higher education. He shoved the paper closer to my chest. "You signed a binding legal contract," Richard yelled. "You cannot just click a button on a website and cancel your obligations because your feelings got hurt over a wedding invitation. You do not have the right to be petty. The law does not care about your hurt pride." I stood there perfectly still. I did not try to grab the paper, I just let him talk, let the enemy reveal all of his weapons before you make a single move. Richard took a step back, folding the paper and slipping it back into his jacket pocket. He looked at me with a triumphant, malicious smile. He thought he had me trapped. He thought he had found the chain to wrap around my neck. "The tuition you owe is $65,000. Richard continued, his voice echoing loudly across my front yard. "But because of your little stunt, Maya suffered a severe panic attack today. She is hyperventilating. She cannot focus on her wedding. The university is threatening to drop her from her classes. So I had my attorneys calculate the damages. Between the late fees, the breach of contract, and the emotional distress you intentionally caused your own daughter, the total comes to exactly $85,000. He paused, letting the number sink in. $85,000. "You are going to wire that money into my account by noon tomorrow," Richard demanded. "If you do not, I will file an emergency injunction in family court. I will sue you for every single penny you have hidden under your mattress. I will put a legal lien on Holloway Construction. I will seize your heavy machinery. I will freeze your payroll accounts until my lawyers bleed you completely dry. I will absolutely destroy the little ghetto empire you spent 40 years building in the dirt. You will die a bankrupt, miserable old man." Preston smirked from behind Richard's shoulder. "You heard him," Julius Preston added arrogantly. "Write the check. Save yourself the embarrassment. You are completely out of your league here." The silence returned to the porch. The only sound was the distant hum of a lawnmower a few streets over. I looked at the two men standing on my property. They had laid all their cards on the table. They had shown me exactly who they were and exactly what they were willing to do to maintain their illusion of superiority. They were willing to use the legal system to extort a 75-year-old man just so they could fund a lavish lifestyle they could not actually afford. They were waiting for my response. They were waiting for me to break. They expected me to argue, to plead poverty, or to angrily refuse so they could have an excuse to call the police. They wanted a fight. I looked right into Richard Kensington's eyes. I looked past the expensive suit, past the perfect hair, and past the arrogant facade. I saw a desperate, hollow man. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply said, "Get off my property." Richard opened his mouth to speak, to launch another threat, but I did not give him the chance. I took a half step back into my hallway. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of my solid oak front door. With one smooth, incredibly forceful motion, I slammed the door shut right in their faces. The sound of the heavy wood hitting the frame was like a gunshot. The walls of my house actually shook. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud, satisfying snap. I stood in the dim light of my hallway holding my coffee mug. Through the thick wood, I could hear Richard screaming in frustration. I could hear him kicking the bottom of the door, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the heavy oak. He was yelling curses, promising to ruin me, promising to see me in court. Let him yell. A barking dog is only dangerous if you open the gate. I turned around and walked back toward my kitchen. The coffee in my mug was still warm. My heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic pattern. I was not afraid of his threats. I was not afraid of a lawsuit. When you have spent your entire life building things from the ground up, you know exactly where the weak points in a structure are. Richard thought he had a solid case built on a divorce decree from over a decade ago. But I knew that every structure has a flaw, and if you hit it in the exact right spot, the whole thing comes crashing down. I walked into my home office and set my coffee down on the desk. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to go to war. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Marcus Davis. Marcus was not a corporate lawyer in a glass tower. He was a ruthless, brilliant attorney who grew up in the same rough neighborhoods I did. We served in the military together. We bled together. He knew the law, but more importantly, he knew how to completely break a bully. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the long, steady dial tone. Outside, I heard the silver BMW start its engine, its tires spinning angrily in the mud before tearing off down the street. The battle lines were drawn. They wanted my money, but they were about to get a masterclass in the consequences of pure greed. I stood in the quiet of my home office, listening to the aggressive roar of the BMW engine fading down the street. The adrenaline in my veins was cold and steady. I did not feel fear. I felt the absolute clarity that comes right before a war. I looked down at my phone. I scrolled past the block number and found the contact for my lawyer and oldest friend. His name was Lawrence. Lawrence was not the kind of attorney you find in a glass skyscraper downtown. He did not play golf with judges or attend fancy political fundraisers. He was a brilliant, ruthless African-American man who grew up on the same exact rough streets of Atlanta that I did. We went back over 40 years. Before he ever put on a suit or stepped inside a courtroom, he worked on my very first construction crew. There was a day in the late 70s when a deep trench collapsed on a foundation site. The wet clay gave way without warning. Lawrence was buried alive up to his chest, the weight of the earth crushing his ribs. The emergency crews were too far away. I jumped into that hole and dug Lawrence out with my bare hands, tearing my fingernails down to the skin, while the earth was trying to swallow him whole. I pulled him out just before the rest of the wall collapsed. He told me that day he owed me his life. He took his wages, went to night school, passed the bar examination, and became the most terrifying defense attorney in the state of Georgia. I pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring. "I need to see you right now," I said into the phone. "It is about Maya and her mother." Lawrence did not ask a single question. He simply told me to meet him at our usual spot in 30 minutes. I grabbed my truck keys and locked the front door. I drove through the streets of Atlanta as the evening fell. I looked at the commercial buildings and the office parks passing by my window. I had poured the concrete for half of those structures. I knew the bones of this city because I helped build them. I drove to a 24-hour diner on the south side. It was a place that smelled of old grease, strong black coffee, and bleach. The neon sign outside buzzed loudly in the humid night air. There were no wealthy investment bankers or entitled trust fund kids here, just truck drivers, night shift nurses, and people who knew what it meant to work for a living. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the back corner. The waitress poured me a cup of coffee without me even having to ask. A few minutes later, the diner door chimed. Lawrence walked in. He was 70 years old, but he moved with the sharp energy of a man much younger. He wore a crisp gray suit, but his eyes were still the eyes of a street fighter. He slid into the booth across from me. He took one look at my face and knew exactly what kind of situation we were dealing with. "Tell me everything from the beginning," Lawrence said quietly. I did not leave out a single detail. I told him about the gold embossed wedding invitation that erased my name. I told him about the sudden realization of my own foolishness. I told him about logging into the university portal and canceling the $65,000 tuition payment. Then I reached into my jacket pocket. I had gone to my filing cabinet before leaving the house and pulled out my own copy of the legal document Richard had shoved in my face. I slid the thick stack of papers across the sticky diner table. "Richard Kensington and Preston Vance just showed up at my front door an hour ago," I explained. "Richard threatened to sue me for $85,000. He demanded that I wire the money by noon tomorrow. He says I am in breach of this agreement." Lawrence picked up the document. It was the finalized divorce decree from the year 2010. I sat there drinking my bitter coffee while Lawrence read through the pages. Watching him read brought back a wave of dark memories. I remembered the year that document was signed. It was the year my ex-wife Vivian finally decided that my calloused hands and long work hours were no longer good enough for her. Vivian always had a taste for luxury that my honest labor could not satisfy quickly enough. When I was out in the sun building my company from nothing, she was attending high society charity galas trying to rub elbows with the Atlanta elite. That was where she met Richard Kensington. Richard played the part of the wealthy investor flawlessly. He wore custom Italian shoes, leased luxury sports cars, and talked a big game about offshore accounts and massive stock portfolios. He convinced Vivian that she was living beneath her true potential by staying married to a blue-collar contractor who came home smelling like diesel fuel. When the divorce happened, Vivian did not just walk away peacefully. She took a massive piece of the empire I had built. She demanded half of the liquid assets from Holloway Construction. She took the money I bled for and used it to fund her new glamorous life with Richard. I agreed to the brutal terms for one reason only. I wanted to make absolutely sure that Maya would never become collateral damage in our war. I agreed to bear the entire financial weight of Maya's education and housing, believing that I was protecting my daughter. Now, 16 years later, Richard was trying to use my own protective instincts as a weapon to extort me. Lawrence finished reading the decree. He set the papers down on the table and tapped his index finger against the wood. His face was completely unreadable. He quoted Section 4, Paragraph B on my front porch, I told Lawrence. He says I am legally mandated to pay for her law school until she graduates. He threatened to file an emergency injunction in family court. He threatened to freeze my payroll accounts and put a lien on my heavy machinery to destroy my business. Lawrence leaned back in the vinyl booth. A slow, dark smile spread across his face. It was the kind of smile a wolf gets right before it spots a wounded deer alone in the woods. "Richard Kensington is an absolute fool," Lawrence said. His voice was low and perfectly calm. "He is a man who relies on aggressive intimidation because he does not actually understand the law. He thinks because he has a piece of paper from 16 years ago he holds all the power. He thinks he can just snap his fingers and freeze your bank accounts by noon tomorrow. That is not how the civil justice system works. You cannot just freeze a corporate payroll without a massive evidentiary hearing. It takes months. He is trying to scare you into writing a check out of pure panic." I nodded. "What else are you thinking?" I asked him. Lawrence leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He lowered his voice. "I am thinking that people who actually have $85,000 in the bank do not show up at another man's house screaming for it. Real wealthy investors do not throw temper tantrums on front porches over a single declined credit card. Think about it, Julius. If Richard is the millionaire he claims to be, why is he panicking over law school tuition? Why is he dragging his future son-in-law to your house to threaten you? Richard is desperate. He is bleeding money and you just shut off his main supply." I thought about what Lawrence was saying. It made perfect sense. The pieces were starting to fit together. If Richard was truly as rich as he claimed to be, paying for Maya's tuition would have been a minor inconvenience to keep up his aristocratic image. Instead, it was an absolute emergency. The facade was cracking. "I want to hire you," I said. "I want you to represent me when he files this lawsuit. I know he is going to file it. He has too much pride to back down now. Let me know what your retainer fee is, and I will write the check right here at this table." Lawrence looked at me. His expression turned deadly serious. He reached across the table and pushed the divorce decree back toward me. "Put your checkbook away right now," Lawrence said. "I am not taking a single dime from you for this case. Over 40 years ago, you pulled me out of the dirt when my lungs were filling with clay. You gave me a second chance to breathe. This is not just another case to me. This is personal." He picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and looked me dead in the eye. "Richard Kensington thinks he can walk onto your property, insult your livelihood, and use the legal system to steal the money you worked your entire life to earn," Lawrence continued. "He thinks you are just a dumb laborer who will roll over out of fear of the courts. We are going to let him file his little lawsuit. We are going to let him step right into the trap." Lawrence paused, his eyes turning cold and absolutely ruthless. "But hear me clearly, Julius," he said. "We do not just defend this case. We do not just aim for a settlement. I am going to unleash my forensic accountants on his life. We are going to dig into every single financial record, every bank account, every tax return, and every hidden secret Richard Kensington has ever buried. When we are finished with him, he will not have a pot to piss in. We do not just defend this, we destroy them." I looked at my oldest friend. I felt a deep sense of peace settle over my shoulders. The fear was entirely gone. The trap was set, the war council was assembled, and the enemy was walking blindly into the dark. I nodded my head once. "Let us go to work," I said. The morning sun was already burning the back of my neck by 8 o'clock. We were framing the second floor of a new commercial structure just off the highway. The air was thick with humidity, smelling of hot tar, fresh sawdust, and the heavy exhaust of diesel engines. This was my sanctuary. Out here in the dirt and the noise, the world made absolute sense. Every steel beam had a purpose. Every concrete pour had a foundation. You put in the hard labor and a building rises. It is an honest transaction. But I was about to be reminded that the world outside of my construction site operates on a very different, very corrupt set of rules. I was standing near the center of the site, reviewing a set of massive architectural blueprints spread across the hood of my pickup truck. My foreman, a broad-shouldered man named David, who had worked for me for 20 years, was standing right beside me. We had a crew of 30 men working the site that day. Hammers were swinging, drills were whining, and the heavy crane was moving pallets of cinder blocks through the sky. I was in my element, surrounded by the men who respected me, the men who knew exactly what kind of man Julius Holloway was. That was when I noticed a vehicle pull into the active loading zone. It was not a supply truck. It was not an inspector vehicle. It was a cheap, faded gray sedan that did not belong on a commercial job site. A man stepped out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a wrinkled beige suit and a cheap tie. He looked nervous, clutching a thick manila envelope tightly against his chest. He was looking around at the massive heavy machinery and the rough men working the site, clearly feeling completely out of place. I watched him approach. I knew exactly what he was before he even opened his mouth. Richard Kensington was a coward, but he was a vindictive coward. He did not send this man to my quiet brick home in the evening. He intentionally sent him here in the broad daylight, right to the center of my business. He wanted this to happen in front of my employees. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted my foreman and my crew to watch their boss get publicly handed a lawsuit. It was a cheap psychological tactic designed to make me feel small in the one place where I was the undisputed king. The man in the wrinkled suit walked up to my truck. He looked from David to me, his eyes darting nervously. "Are you Julius Holloway?" the man asked. His voice was barely loud enough to be heard over the roar of a passing cement mixer. I did not break eye contact with him. I folded my arms across my chest. "I am Julius Holloway," I replied, my voice deep and perfectly steady. The man quickly shoved the thick manila envelope into my hands as if it were a burning piece of coal. He took 2 fast steps backward. "You have been served," he practically whispered, and then he turned around and almost sprinted back to his faded sedan. The heavy machinery continued to roar all around us, but a strange silence fell over the men standing closest to my truck. David looked at the envelope in my hands, his jaw tight. He knew what was happening, but he had the absolute respect not to say a single word. I did not hide the envelope. I did not walk away to open it in private. If Richard wanted a public spectacle, I would show my men exactly how a real man handles a threat. I leaned against the hood of my truck and ripped the top of the envelope open. I pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal paper. The front page was stamped with the official seal of the Superior Court of Fulton County. Below the seal, the names of the plaintiffs were printed in bold black ink: Richard Kensington and Vivian Kensington. Below that was my name listed as the sole defendant. I flipped to the second page. The list of demands and allegations was extensive and completely absurd. They were officially suing me for $85,000. They claimed I was in malicious breach of a legally binding contract. They claimed I owed back tuition, future tuition, and accumulated late fees. But the line that made me let out a short, bitter laugh was the final charge. They were suing me for the intentional infliction of emotional distress. They were claiming that my refusal to be treated like an endless ATM machine had caused them severe psychological trauma. Richard, a man who lived in a gated mansion and drove a $100,000 car, was begging a judge to force a 75-year-old construction worker to pay him for his hurt feelings. It was a breathtaking display of pure, unadulterated entitlement. I continued reading through the legal jargon. I was completely calm. Lawrence had already warned me this was coming. I knew their strategy. But then I reached the final section of the document. It was the section dedicated to sworn witness affidavits. I flipped the page, and the air suddenly left my lungs. There at the bottom of the page was a signature I had known since she first learned how to hold a crayon. It was Maya's handwriting. I stared at the looping letters of her new name, Maya Kensington. My heart gave a violent, heavy thud against my ribs. A sharp, burning physical pain shot straight through the center of my chest. It felt as though someone had taken a long, rusted blade and pushed it slowly between my ribs. I forced my eyes to read the paragraphs above her signature. It was a sworn statement submitted under the penalty of perjury. In those pages, the daughter I had sacrificed my entire life for completely rewrote our history. She claimed that I had always used money as a weapon to control her. She stated that I was an absent father who cared more about my construction business than her well-being. She told the court that I had created a hostile and emotionally abusive environment, and that Richard Kensington was the only man who had ever provided her with true paternal security. She claimed that my decision to stop paying her tuition was a malicious, calculated attempt to ruin her wedding and destroy her academic future out of pure jealousy. I stood there in the baking Georgia sun feeling completely frozen. The pain in my chest was blinding. This was not Richard's doing. Richard could write all the lies he wanted, but he could not force Maya to sign her name to them. She read these words. She agreed to them. She willingly signed a legal document painting the man who fed her, clothed her, and funded her entire privileged life as an abusive monster just so she could extort $85,000 from him. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent breathing toxic fiberglass dust. I thought about the days I worked through brutal back pain so I could send her the rent money for her luxury apartment. I thought about the sheer unconditional love I had poured into her empty cup for 26 years. And this piece of paper was my return on investment. The physical pain in my chest lasted for exactly 1 minute. Then it died. It did not fade away slowly. It was instantly incinerated by a wave of cold, absolute, indestructible anger. The grief was gone. The father who loved Maya Holloway died standing next to that pickup truck. The man who remained was Julius Holloway, the veteran, the builder, the survivor. Maya was gone. The girl I raised was completely gone, replaced by a greedy, ruthless stranger who wore her mother's face and carried her stepfather's arrogance. And you do not show mercy to strangers who try to destroy your life. I carefully folded the thick stack of legal papers. I slid them back into the manila envelope. I looked up at my foreman. David was watching me closely, waiting for a command. "Get the men back to work on the north wall," I told David. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion. "We need that concrete poured before noon. I'm going to make a phone call." David nodded sharply. "You got it, boss," he said, turning around to bark orders at the crew. The heavy machinery roared back to life, drowning out the silence. I opened the heavy door of my truck and climbed up into the cab. I closed the door, sealing myself inside the quiet, air-conditioned space. I did not sit there and cry. I did not stare at the steering wheel and wonder where I went wrong. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled through the contacts and pressed the button to call Lawrence. He answered immediately, as if he had been sitting by the phone waiting for this exact moment. "They did it," I said, staring out the windshield at the massive steel frame of the building my men were putting together. "I assume they served you at the job site to put on a show?" Lawrence replied, his voice calm and knowing. "Right in front of my crew," I confirmed. "They are asking for $85,000, emotional distress, breach of contract." There was a brief pause on the line. "Are there sworn affidavits attached to the complaint?" Lawrence asked. "Yes," I said. My voice dropped an octave, turning into hard gravel. "My ex-wife, Richard, and Maya. She signed a statement calling me an abusive, neglectful father who uses money to ruin her life. She signed her name to it, Lawrence." I heard Lawrence exhale slowly through his nose. The silence stretched for a moment. He understood exactly what that meant. He understood that the final bridge had just been burned to the ground. "Julius," Lawrence said softly, "are you ready to take the gloves off? Because once I start pulling the threads on Richard Kensington's life, there is no going back. We are not just going to win this case. We are going to expose every single lie they have ever told. It will be incredibly ugly. Are you prepared for that?" I looked down at my hands. I looked at the thick calluses, the deep scars, the permanent dirt embedded in the creases of my skin. I had spent my entire life building things. But sometimes before you can build something new, you have to operate the wrecking ball. You have to swing the heavy iron and shatter the rotten structure completely down to its foundations. I brought the phone back to my ear. "Own." "Dig into Richard," I commanded. My voice was as cold and hard as the steel beams outside my window. "Dig into everything. Check his taxes, check his bank records, check his credit history. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want to know how he pays for his suits. I want to know how he pays for his cars. And I want to know exactly how much debt he is hiding behind that fake smile. Destroy his entire world, Lawrence." "Consider it done," Lawrence said. "The hunt begins today. Bring the papers to my office tonight." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I picked up my hard hat, opened the door of my truck, and stepped back out into the blazing Georgia heat. The war had officially begun, and I was going to bury them all. I drove straight from the dusty construction site to the downtown financial district of Atlanta. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time I parked my heavy pickup truck outside the towering glass and steel building where Lawrence kept his offices. It was a place designed entirely to make ordinary people feel small and intimidated. The lobby was lined with imported Italian marble and polished brass fixtures. Men in tailored suits and women in designer shoes walked quickly past me, averting their eyes from my heavy work boots and my faded denim jeans. They looked at me as if I did not belong there, but they did not know that my company had poured the very concrete foundation for the skyscraper right next door. I knew exactly what was underneath all that polished marble. It was just dirt and steel. I walked into the silent elevator holding the thick manila envelope containing the lawsuit and pressed the button for the 35th floor. Lawrence was waiting for me in his expansive corner office. The room was mostly dark, lit only by the glowing city skyline outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and a small brass desk lamp illuminating the open files spread across his desk. He did not wear his expensive suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, revealing the faint scars on his forearms from our days working the heavy machinery together. There was another man in the room sitting quietly on the dark leather sofa. He was much younger, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and holding a sleek silver laptop on his knees. "Julius," Lawrence said as I walked into the room. He pointed to the young man. "This is David. He is the best forensic accountant in the entire state of Georgia. If someone is hiding a single dollar in an offshore account, burying it under a mattress, or washing it through a fake business, David is the man who finds it." I nodded respectfully to the young man. I walked over and set the manila envelope down on the heavy wooden desk with a loud thud. "The lawsuit has officially arrived," I said, my voice completely flat. "They are demanding $85,000 for breach of contract and intentional infliction of emotional distress." And Maya signed a sworn affidavit claiming I am an abusive father who ruined her life with my financial control. Lawrence did not look surprised or alarmed. He simply reached out and placed his large hand flat over the envelope. He looked over at David. The young accountant opened his laptop. The blue glow of the screen reflected sharply in his glasses. "We have already started digging into the life of Richard Kensington." Lawrence said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "When you go to war against a man who relies on intimidation, you do not just swing your fists blindly. You find the weakest point in his armor, and you drive the blade right through it. Richard has spent the last 16 years parading around this city as a high-rolling investment banker. Vivian left you because she wanted that elite high society lifestyle. So I asked David to take a very close microscopic look at the Kensington financial empire." David hit a few keys on his laptop keyboard. The heavy laser printer in the corner of the office hummed to life, spitting out a thick stack of warm papers. Lawrence picked them up, sorted through them, and handed the top page directly to me. "Look closely at that first document," Lawrence instructed. I looked down at the paper. It was a corporate registration record filed in the state of Delaware. The company name printed at the top was Kensington Capital Investments. "That is his supposed equity firm," David explained, his voice calm, analytical, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Richard Kensington claims to manage tens of millions of dollars in private wealth. He has a very prestigious office address listed in Buckhead, the wealthiest neighborhood in Atlanta. But when I pulled the commercial lease records and the utility bills for that specific address, I found out it is nothing more than a virtual office. He pays $250 a month to have a receptionist answer a shared phone line and collect his incoming mail. The office itself does not actually exist. Kensington Capital Investments is a hollow shell company. It has 0 employees on payroll, 0 registered corporate assets, and 0 active client portfolios." I stared at the black ink on the paper. For 16 long years, my ex-wife Vivian had looked down her nose at me because I worked with my bare hands in the hot sun, while her sophisticated new husband worked in high finance. And it was all a complete and utter illusion. A stage play put on by a con artist in a custom suit. "It gets much worse," Lawrence said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the desk. "A man cannot live in a gated mansion, wear Italian leather shoes, and drive a $100,000 German luxury car on 0 income. So the obvious question becomes, where is the money actually coming from?" David typed another command into his computer system. We pulled his public tax filings, ran a deep background credit sweep, and accessed the public records for his property deeds. The accountant continued. "Richard Kensington has not reported a substantial, verifiable income to the federal government in over 7 years. What he has actually been doing is living entirely off a mountain of debt. He takes out massive personal loans from high-interest secondary lenders. He then uses the cash from one new loan to pay off the minimum monthly balance on another older loan. It is a classic, textbook financial house of cards. But here is the most interesting part of the puzzle. 6 months ago, the banks finally realized what he was doing, and they cut him off completely. His personal credit is maxed out beyond repair. He could not even get approved for a basic store credit card right now if he tried." I stood there in the quiet office, slowly processing the magnitude of the information. Richard Kensington was completely broke. The tailored suits, the luxury cars, the exclusive country club memberships, they were all bought on borrowed time and borrowed money that he could never repay. "But that simply does not make sense," I said, looking from David to Lawrence. "I just received the gold-embossed wedding invitation in the mail. Maya is getting married at the most exclusive and expensive botanical garden venue in the city. Her silk wedding dress alone probably cost $10,000. Add in the catering for 200 guests, the imported floral arrangements, the live band, and the professional photography. That wedding has to cost at least $100,000, if not more. If Richard is completely cut off from the banks and his business is completely fake, how is he paying for this extravagant wedding event?" Lawrence smiled. It was that same dark, predatory smile I had seen in the diner the night before. "That, my friend, is the exact question we are going to force him to answer under oath during the legal deposition." David turned his laptop screen around toward me so I could clearly see the complex spreadsheet he had built. "When people are desperate and the walls are closing in, they make very stupid, traceable mistakes," the accountant said, pointing to a highlighted column of numbers. Richard's bank accounts show a consistent pattern of regular cash deposits over the last 3 years. These deposits perfectly match the exact timeline of when your daughter started her undergraduate degree in Boston. I felt a cold, sharp realization creeping up the back of my neck. "What exactly are you saying?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I am saying," Lawrence interjected softly, "that the incredibly generous monthly allowance you have been sending to Maya for her rent, her food, and her expensive textbooks was not staying in her bank account. We suspect Richard has been systematically intercepting that money. He has been taking the cash you worked in the dirt to earn, and he has been using it to pay the leases on his luxury cars and keep the electricity turned on in his mansion. You have not just been supporting your daughter's education, Julius. You have been quietly funding Richard Kensington's fake aristocratic lifestyle for years." The air in the office went completely still. I thought about the days I skipped my own meals to make sure Maya's account was full. I thought about the freezing winter months when I drove a truck with a broken heater because I wanted to save the repair money for her emergency fund. I thought about the times my lower back screamed in absolute agony, but I picked up the heavy steel tools anyway because she called me and said she needed a new laptop for her classes. All that blood, all that sweat, all that unconditional sacrifice, secretly siphoned off by a parasite who had the nerve to stand on my porch and call my home a ghetto shack. "And now that you pressed that button and cut off the massive law school tuition payment," Lawrence continued, his voice cutting sharply through the heavy silence, "Richard is in a full-blown sheer panic. He is not suing you because he wants to protect Maya's legal education. He could not care less about her degree. He is suing you because he desperately needs that $85,000 in cash to pay off his aggressive creditors before his cars are repossessed and his mansion goes into active foreclosure. He is using your daughter as a human shield to rob you blind." I looked down at the manila envelope resting on the polished desk. The sworn affidavit inside with Maya's signature suddenly felt like a physical weight in the room. "Does she know the truth?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Does Maya know her stepfather is completely broke? Does she know he has been stealing my money from her accounts?" Lawrence shook his head slowly. "We do not know for sure. She might be completely brainwashed by the image he projects. She might actually believe he is the wealthy savior and you are just the abusive, withholding villain. Or she might know absolutely everything, and she is actively participating in the fraud to protect her own new social image with her wealthy fiancé. Either way, she made a conscious choice to sign a sworn legal statement attacking your character to extort you. She chose her side of the battlefield." I stood up from the chair and walked over to the massive glass window. The sprawling city of Atlanta stretched out before me, a vast sea of glittering lights shining in the darkness. I had built this city with my own two hands. I was a man of the earth, a man of solid, unbreakable foundations. I did not play games with smoke and mirrors. Richard Kensington had built his entire existence on a foundation of lies, and he actually thought he could use the legal system to force me to pay for his crumbling castle. He wanted a fight, I said, staring out at the glowing city streets below. He thought he could serve me with legal papers at my job site and I would just roll over and write a check out of pure fear. He thought I was just a dumb laborer. Lawrence stood up and walked over to stand beside me at the window. "He is a predator who is used to hunting weak, defenseless prey," Lawrence said, his reflection visible in the glass. "He has absolutely no idea that he just walked directly into the den of a hungry lion." "What is our next move?" I asked, turning to face my lawyer. "We wait," Lawrence replied with absolute confidence. "We file a formal, aggressive response to the lawsuit denying all of their absurd allegations. We immediately demand a full discovery process. We force them to sit in a conference room for a formal deposition under oath. We let Richard and his expensive, arrogant lawyer sit across the table and act like they own the world. We let them dig their own grave with their endless lies. And then when they think they have you completely cornered and defeated, we drop the hammer on their entire lives." I turned away from the window and looked at the two men in the office. David was already typing furiously on his sleek laptop, digging even deeper into the hidden financial records following the digital trail of stolen money across state lines. Lawrence was standing tall, his eyes burning with the fierce anticipation of the brutal courtroom battle to come. "I want everything," I told Lawrence, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "I do not just want to win this simple lawsuit. I want to expose his fake shell company to the federal authorities. I want his desperate creditors to know exactly where he is hiding. I want his wealthy country club friends to see that he is nothing but a broke, pathetic con artist. And I want the prominent family of the man Maya is marrying to know exactly what kind of criminal enterprise they are joining. If they want to drag the Holloway name through the mud, I am going to make sure the Kensington name is completely and utterly destroyed." Lawrence nodded slowly, a fierce determination settling over his features. We are going to take everything from him, Julius. We are going to rip down the entire facade. We are going to show your daughter exactly what kind of man she chose to call her father. The hunt in the shadows has just begun. I walked back to the heavy wooden desk, picked up the thick manila envelope containing the lawsuit, and threw it directly into the heavy metal trash can in the corner of the room. The sound of the thick paper hitting the bottom echoed loudly. The grief that had weighed down my heart earlier that morning was completely gone. I was a builder by trade, but I was fully prepared to become a wrecking ball. I was ready for war. I sat in the heavy leather chair in Lawrence's office as the sun began to rise over the city of Atlanta. The sky was turning a bruised shade of purple and dull orange. We had been awake all night. My eyes were burning from the lack of sleep and the harsh glow of the brass desk lamp, but my mind was completely sharp. The large mahogany desk was completely covered in stacks of financial records, bank statements, and tax returns. The young forensic accountant David was rubbing his tired eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He had spent the last 8 hours tearing down the fake walls of Richard Kensington's life. Lawrence walked over to the coffee maker in the corner of the room and poured 3 fresh cups of black coffee. He handed one to me and one to David. The smell of the dark roast grounded me. I took a slow sip, feeling the heat slide down my throat. "Show him the rest of it," Lawrence said quietly, looking over at the young accountant. "Show Julius exactly what kind of man is sleeping in the same house as his daughter." David set his coffee mug down and picked up a thick stack of papers stapled together at the corner. He slid the packet across the polished wood of the desk until it rested right in front of me. I looked down at the top page. It was a credit report, but it did not belong to Richard. The name printed at the top was Maya Holloway. I stared at my daughter's name. "Why are you pulling my daughter's credit history?" I asked, my voice low and tight. "Because Richard Kensington is a parasite." David explained, his voice steady and clinical. "When a parasite completely exhausts its host, it does not just die. It searches for a new blood supply. As we discovered last night, Richard is completely bankrupt. He has no assets, no real income, and his personal credit score is effectively ruined. No legitimate bank in the country would lend him a single dollar. But 6 months ago, Richard desperately needed cash to maintain his country club memberships, his luxury car leases, and the mortgage on that massive gated mansion." David pointed a pale finger at a column of numbers on the second page of the report. "Look at the dates on these loan originations," David said. I followed his finger. There were 4 massive personal loans taken out within a span of 3 weeks. Each loan was for over $50,000. The total debt accumulated in less than a month was staggering. "These are high-interest, unsecured personal loans," David continued. "They are the kind of loans people take out when they are absolutely desperate. But Richard did not take them out. He could not. Instead, he used Maya. He used her pristine, clean credit history. She is a law student with a flawless background and 0 existing debt because you paid for absolutely everything in cash." To a predatory lender, she looked like the perfect candidate. "Are you saying he stole her identity?" I asked, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. "No," Lawrence stepped in, his voice dark and heavy. "He did not steal her identity. That would imply she is an innocent victim who had no idea what was happening. We pulled the electronic signature records. Maya willingly co-signed every single one of those loans. Richard convinced her to put her name on the dotted line. He probably fed her some sophisticated lie about needing temporary liquidity for a massive offshore investment. He manipulated her trust and used her name to secure over $200,000 in toxic debt." I sat back in my chair, my heavy work boots resting on the thick carpet. My daughter, the bright young woman who was supposed to be studying the law, was entirely legally bound to a mountain of garbage debt. If Richard defaulted on those loans, the banks would not go after his empty shell company. They would go directly after Maya. They would destroy her financial future before her career even began. "But that is not the worst part," Julius, Lawrence said softly. He nodded to David. The accountant pulled out another folder. This one was a bright, glaring red. He opened it and laid out a series of bank transfer receipts. I recognized these documents immediately. They were copies of the cleared checks from my own business account. I looked at the dates and the amounts. Every month, on the first day of the month, I had my bank wire exactly $3,500 to an account Maya told me was her primary checking. That money was specifically designated for her expensive apartment rent in Boston, her utilities, her groceries, and her law school textbooks. I had sent that money religiously without fail for 3 entire years. I had worked through brutal summer heat waves and freezing winter storms to make sure that money was always there. Look at the routing numbers on the receiving end, David instructed, pointing his pen at the bottom of the cleared checks. I looked closely. The money was originally deposited into Maya's account just as I intended. But exactly 24 hours later, every single month, almost the entire amount was automatically transferred out to a secondary account. Where did it go? I asked, the anger rising in my chest like a slow tide. It went directly to a joint checking account controlled by Richard Kensington, David said. We traced the outgoing payments from that specific joint account. The money you sent for your daughter's food and shelter never paid for her food and shelter. That $3,500 was used every single month to pay the lease on Richard's silver BMW 7 Series and Vivian's Mercedes-Benz SUV. The silence in the office was deafening. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning vent above us. I stared at the numbers on the paper until they blurred together. Richard did not just steal from me. He took the sweat from my brow, the aches in my back, and the calluses on my hands, and he turned them into leather seats and luxury rims for his own arrogant ego. And Vivian, my ex-wife, allowed it to happen. She drove around the wealthy neighborhoods of Atlanta pretending to be high society, completely fueled by the manual labor of the man she had abandoned. But the hardest pill to swallow, the one that felt like crushed glass in my throat, was Maya's role in all of it. How was she paying her rent? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. If Richard was taking my money, how was she surviving in Boston? Student loans, Lawrence answered grimly. She has been taking out maximum federal and private student loans to cover her living expenses while giving your cash to her stepfather. She is drowning in debt, Julius. Richard has completely drained her dry to keep his sinking ship afloat. For a brief, fleeting moment, I felt a sharp stab of pity for my daughter. She was a fool. She had been blinded by the polished floors of country clubs and the smooth, talking charm of a con artist. She had traded a father who built a solid foundation for her, for a man who was actively burying her alive. I thought about calling her. I thought about picking up the phone, driving to her dress fitting, and shaking her until she woke up. I wanted to tell her she was being used. I wanted to save her. But then my eyes drifted over to the metal trash can in the corner of the office. Resting inside that trash can was the manila envelope I had received yesterday at the construction site. The pity died. It evaporated like a drop of water on a hot iron stove. I remembered the sworn affidavit. I remembered her signature at the bottom of the page. She was not a helpless child anymore. She was 26 years old. She was a law student. She knew exactly what she was doing when she handed over that money, and she certainly knew what she was doing when she signed a legal document claiming I was an abusive monster. She knew Richard was desperate. She knew the well had run dry because I cut off the tuition. And instead of questioning the man who had been draining her accounts for 3 years, she decided to attack the man who had funded her entire existence. She chose to participate in the extortion. She chose to be the weapon Richard pointed at my head. She is not a victim, I said out loud. The words tasted like ash, but they were the absolute truth. She made her choice. Lawrence watched me carefully. He knew exactly what internal battle I was fighting, and he knew I had just won it. So what is the play? Lawrence asked, folding his arms across his chest. We have all the ammunition we need to blow his life to pieces. We do exactly what you said, I replied, standing up from the heavy leather chair. My muscles were stiff, but my resolve was like forged steel. We let them think they have the upper hand. We schedule the formal deposition. We bring them all into a room under oath. Let Richard put on his tailored suit. Let his expensive lawyer act arrogant. Let Maya sit across from me and pretend she is the injured party. I looked down at the mountain of financial records, exposing their massive fraud. We let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly can, I said, walking toward the door. And then we bury them. Schedule the deposition, Lawrence. It is time to end this. Lawrence smiled that dark, ruthless smile once again. I will make the call today, he said. I walked out of the towering glass building and back into the morning sun. The air was already thick and humid. I climbed into my dusty pickup truck and started the engine. I had a construction site to run and a foundation to finish. Richard Kensington had spent his life building a house of cards, and he was about to learn what happens when you pick a fight with a man who knows how to tear things down. 3 weeks later, I walked into a conference room on the 42nd floor of a downtown legal building. The air conditioning was turned up so high that the room felt like a meat locker. It was a sterile, lifeless space. There were no windows, just stark white walls and a massive glass table sitting in the absolute center of the room. This was not a place where things were built. This was a place where lives were dissected and destroyed. I wore a simple dark suit that I had owned for 10 years. My heavy work boots were replaced by polished leather shoes, but my hands were still the rough, scarred hands of a builder. I sat down on one side of the cold glass table. Lawrence took the seat right next to me. He placed his slim leather briefcase on the table and folded his hands. He did not open the briefcase. He did not need to. We already knew exactly what was inside it, and we were fully prepared to use it. On the other side of the glass table sat the people who had decided to declare war on me. Richard Kensington was wearing a charcoal gray suit with a silk tie. He sat tall, trying to project the image of a wealthy patriarch, but I could see the faint beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His arrogant posture was forced. Vivian sat next to him wearing too much perfume and a heavy pearl necklace. She looked at me with that same condescending sneer she had perfected 16 years ago when she decided my manual labor was no longer good enough to fund her social ambitions. And then there was Maya, my daughter. She wore a conservative navy blue dress. She looked pale and exhausted. From the moment I walked into the room, she refused to make eye contact with me. She stared down at her hands, resting nervously on her lap, avoiding the reality of what she had done. Next to them sat their attorney. He was a white man in his late 40s with slicked back hair and a heavy gold watch that he made sure everyone could see when he rested his arms on the table. He looked at me as if I were a piece of dirt someone had tracked onto his expensive carpet. He was a man who made his living by tearing down people he considered beneath him. He was completely unaware that he had just walked into a trap. A court reporter sat at the end of the table typing quietly on a small machine. She asked me to raise my right hand and swear to tell the truth. I raised my calloused hand and I swore the oath. The opposing lawyer leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass. He introduced himself as Arthur Sterling, senior partner at the firm. He spoke with a smooth, practiced voice that dripped with absolute arrogance. He wanted to establish dominance immediately. He wanted me to feel like a small, uneducated laborer who had wandered into a room full of intellectual giants. He began his questioning by asking me to state my name and occupation for the official record. I told him my name was Julius Holloway and that I owned a construction company. He smiled a thin, patronizing smile. He asked me to describe my income. He used the word modest repeatedly. He asked if it was true that I spent most of my time doing physical labor in the dirt. He asked if I had ever attended a prestigious university like the one Maya was currently enrolled in. He was trying to paint a carefully crafted picture for the court record. He wanted to show that I was a low-class, bitter man who was deeply jealous of the sophisticated life Richard and Vivian had provided for my daughter. He wanted to establish a motive for my actions based entirely on personal insecurity and financial inadequacy. The lawyer opened a thick folder and pulled out the sworn affidavit Maya had signed. He read aloud from the document, making sure his voice echoed loudly off the sterile white walls. He read the words, financial abuse and emotional abandonment. He read the paragraphs where Maya claimed I had used my money to manipulate her choices and control her freedom. He asked me if I felt threatened by Richard Kensington. He asked me if canceling my daughter's tuition was a petty act of revenge because I realized I could never give her the social status that her new stepfather could effortlessly provide. He painted Richard as the heroic, wealthy savior and me as the spiteful, deadbeat father who was trying to ruin a beautiful wedding out of pure spite. Every single question was designed to provoke me. He wanted me to slam my fists on the table. He wanted me to raise my voice and sound like an angry, unreasonable old man. He wanted to prove that I was exactly the hostile monster Maya had described in her fabricated statement. If I lost my temper, I would give them exactly what they needed to win their case. But I did not give him a single ounce of emotion. I remembered what Lawrence had told me. Anger is loud, but true power is completely silent. I answered his insulting questions with short, flat sentences. I said yes. I said no. I did not elaborate. I did not defend my honor because my honor did not need defending against a room full of liars and thieves. I let him talk. I let him fill the sterile room with his arrogant assumptions and his insulting narrative. I sat there like a stone wall, letting his words bounce off me without leaving a single mark. While the lawyer continued his long-winded attempts to humiliate me, I shifted my focus entirely away from him. I turned my head slightly and locked my eyes directly onto Maya. I did not glare at her. I did not look at her with hatred or sorrow. I looked at her with the cold, heavy weight of absolute truth. I stared at the young woman who had taken my money for 26 years and then signed her name to a document calling me an abuser just so her bankrupt stepfather could extort $85,000 from me. I let my silence press down on her chest. For her entire life, I had looked at her with nothing but pride and unconditional love. I had looked at her as my greatest achievement. But now I looked at her as a stranger, I examined her face with the clinical detachment of a contractor inspecting a rotten piece of wood before tearing it out of a building. The lawyer kept talking, asking me about my supposed failure as a father, but I completely ignored him. I just kept my eyes fixed entirely on Maya, letting the heavy silence of my gaze speak louder than any words I could possibly say. The tension in the room began to shift dramatically. The psychological pressure of the room changed completely. The lawyer noticed that his aggressive tactics were having absolutely no effect on me. Richard noticed that I was not backing down or showing any signs of intimidation. But Maya felt it the most. The longer I stared at her, the more incredibly uncomfortable she became. She shifted nervously in her heavy leather chair. She crossed and uncrossed her legs. She reached up to touch the collar of her dress, trying to soothe herself. She was trying desperately to keep her eyes focused on the glass table, but the weight of my gaze was too heavy to ignore. She finally glanced up, and our eyes met for the first time in an entire month. In that single silent moment, she saw exactly what was inside me. She saw that the endless bank account was closed forever. She saw that the father who used to forgive her every mistake and pay for every luxury was gone. She saw a man who knew exactly what she had done and felt absolutely no pity for her. Her breathing became noticeably shallow. Her hands began to tremble slightly on her lap. She looked away quickly, her face turning a pale, sickly color. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her. She realized that I was not afraid of their high-priced lawyer, and I was not afraid of their lawsuit. The opposing lawyer realized his strategy was completely failing. He was trying his hardest to break me, but I was the one breaking his client without saying a single word. He raised his voice, trying to regain control of the room and force me to submit. He asked me directly why I maliciously abandoned my legal and financial obligations to my only daughter. I sat perfectly still. I did not answer him immediately. I let the silence stretch out until it became incredibly uncomfortable for everyone on the other side of the glass table. I watched the fake confidence slowly drain from Richard's face as he realized his intimidation tactics had completely failed. I watched Vivian nervously touch her pearl necklace, her eyes darting around the room. I watched Maya look like she wanted to sink into the floor and disappear. Then I slowly turned my head to look at Lawrence. It was time. We had let them build their arrogant little house of cards as high as they wanted. Now it was time to kick the table. Lawrence gave me a single brief nod. He reached forward and unlatched the brass locks on his slim leather briefcase. The metal clicked loudly in the silent room. The defense was officially over. The demolition was about to begin. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches on the leather briefcase echoed loudly in the freezing conference room. The sound cut right through the heavy silence. Arthur Sterling, the arrogant opposing lawyer, stopped talking and leaned back in his expensive chair. He looked confused. He had spent the last hour trying to break my spirit with insulting questions, and I had given him absolutely nothing but a blank stare. Now the dynamic of the room was shifting out of his control. Lawrence slowly opened the lid of his briefcase. He did not rush. He moved with the calm, deliberate precision of a surgeon preparing to make a very deep incision. He reached inside and pulled out a single piece of heavy paper. It was not a legal brief or a bank statement. It was the thick cream-colored wedding invitation with the shimmering gold foil pressed into the edges. Lawrence held the invitation by the corner and slid it slowly across the smooth glass table. It came to a stop directly in front of Maya. "I would like to direct my next series of questions to the Keo plaintiff, Miss Maya Kensington," Lawrence said, his voice echoing clearly off the sterile white walls. Arthur Sterling immediately sat up straight and adjusted his silk tie. He looked at the invitation and frowned. "You have already had your turn questioning my client," Arthur said. "This deposition is regarding a breach of financial contract, not wedding planning." Lawrence turned his head slowly and looked at Arthur with eyes as cold as ice. "The plaintiffs claim that my client maliciously abandoned his daughter and caused her severe emotional distress," Lawrence replied smoothly. "In order to understand the nature of this supposed distress, we need to establish the exact state of the relationship between the father and the daughter prior to the cancellation of the tuition payment. I have the legal right to establish a timeline of events." Arthur Sterling tightened his jaw, but he did not object again. He waved his hand dismissively, signaling for Lawrence to continue. Lawrence looked back down at Maya. She was staring at the gold-embossed wedding invitation resting on the glass table in front of her. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and her knuckles were completely white. "Miss Kensington," Lawrence began, his voice calm and methodical. "Please identify the document resting on the table in front of you." Maya swallowed hard. She glanced nervously at her mother Vivian and then at her stepfather Richard before looking back at the paper. "It is an invitation to my wedding," she answered, her voice sounding incredibly small in the large room. "And who are the people listed on this invitation as the hosts of the wedding?" Lawrence asked. Maya kept her eyes glued to the table. She read the words aloud. "Mr. and Mrs. Richard Kensington." Lawrence took a slow, deliberate step away from his chair. "And can you please read the name of the bride printed in the center of the page?" he instructed. Maya hesitated. I could see the muscles in her neck tighten. She took a shallow breath and said, "Maya Kensington." Lawrence nodded slowly. "Maya Kensington. That is a very beautiful name. But it is not the name printed on your birth certificate, is it? It is not the name printed on your undergraduate degree from Boston. And it is certainly not the name printed on the $65,000 tuition invoice that my client Julius Holloway paid for you just 3 weeks before this invitation was mailed out." Arthur Sterling opened his mouth to object, but Lawrence raised his hand to silence him. "Miss Kensington," Lawrence continued, his voice growing slightly firmer, "can you please explain for the official court record exactly why Julius Holloway's name does not appear anywhere on this document? Can you explain why you erased the man who funded your entire life from the most important day of your life?" Maya finally looked up. The fear in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a defensive, arrogant anger. She had been taught by her mother and her stepfather that she was entitled to the absolute best the world had to offer, and that anyone who questioned her was simply beneath her. She squared her shoulders and looked directly at Lawrence. "I did not erase anyone," Maya said, her voice growing louder and more confident. "I simply chose to represent my true family. Preston comes from a very prominent family with a long history in this state. Social circles matter in our world. Image matters. When Preston's parents host events, they invite politicians and corporate executives. They do not invite men who wear dirty work boots and smell like diesel fuel." I sat perfectly still on my side of the table, listening to the daughter I raised call me a social embarrassment. Vivian smiled, a faint, proud smile from across the table, clearly pleased that her daughter had absorbed her snobbish worldview. Richard puffed out his chest, looking incredibly smug. "So you are saying that my client, your biological father, is an embarrassment to your new social circle?" Lawrence asked, clarifying her statement for the court reporter. "He is an anchor," Maya replied, her tone dripping with absolute entitlement. "He has always been a blue-collar laborer. There is nothing wrong with that, but it is not who I am anymore. Richard stepped into my life and showed me how the real world operates. Richard understands high society, he understands investment banking and country clubs and how to carry a conversation with important people. Richard has been my true father figure. He provided the emotional guidance and the sophisticated environment that Julius could never give me." Lawrence nodded slowly, acting as if he completely understood her perspective. "I see. Richard Kensington is your true father figure because he wears tailored suits and understands high society. So if Richard is your true father figure and he provides everything you need, why are you currently suing a blue-collar construction worker for $85,000? If Julius Holloway is so beneath your new elite social standing, why do you want his dirty money?" The question hit the room like a physical blow. Richard's smug smile instantly vanished. Vivian stopped touching her pearl necklace. Maya looked completely caught off guard. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Arthur Sterling immediately intervened, slamming his hand on the glass table. "Objection," he shouted. "You are harassing my client. The reason we are demanding the money is because Julius Holloway signed a legally binding divorce decree 16 years ago promising to pay for her education. The law requires him to pay. Her personal feelings about his social status are entirely irrelevant to his financial obligations." Lawrence did not even look at Arthur. He kept his eyes locked onto Maya. "You claim Julius was emotionally abusive and controlling," Lawrence said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "But the only control Julius ever exercised was clicking a button to stop paying for the life of a woman who told the world he no longer existed. You changed your last name to Kensington because you wanted to belong to a wealthy investment banker. You wanted the prestige without putting in the work. You threw away the name Holloway because it sounded too much like hard labor." Maya glared at Lawrence, her face turning red with anger. "I deserve that money," she snapped, losing her composure completely. "He owes it to me. I am entitled to my law school education, and he signed a contract saying he would pay for it. He cannot just cut me off because he is jealous that I prefer Richard's family over his. It is my money. She said it with such absolute conviction that it was almost breathtaking. "It is my money." She truly believed that the sweat from my brow belonged to her by divine right. She believed she could spit in my face, change her identity, and still reach directly into my bank account whenever she wanted. Lawrence stood perfectly still, letting her entitled outburst echo in the quiet room. The court reporter typed furiously, capturing every single arrogant word. We had exactly what we needed. We had established her motive, her entitlement, and her absolute belief that Richard Kensington was her true father. Now it was time to spring the trap. Lawrence walked back to his chair and looked down at his open briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a second document. This one was heavily stamped with red state certification seals. It was the official family court document that David the accountant had unearthed during his deep background investigation. Lawrence held the document in his hand, but he did not slide it across the table. He looked directly at Maya, his eyes burning with a fierce, ruthless intelligence. "You keep referring to yourself as Maya Kensington," Lawrence said, his voice incredibly calm but carrying a heavy underlying threat. "You told us today that you changed your name to fit in with your new wealthy social circle. You told us that Richard Kensington is your true father figure." Maya crossed her arms over her chest, looking defiant. "Yes, he is," she answered sharply. Lawrence tilted his head slightly. "Is it just a name change?" Miss Kensington Lawrence asked. "Or was there another legal procedure involved? Did you and Richard take your relationship a step further to impress Preston's wealthy parents before the wedding?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. The defiance completely vanished from Maya's face. All the color drained out of her cheeks, leaving her looking like a pale ghost. Richard Kensington physically jolted in his chair, his eyes widening in absolute sheer panic. Vivian let out a small, sharp gasp and covered her mouth with her hand. Arthur Sterling looked at his clients and realized immediately that they were hiding something massive from him. He jumped out of his chair, his heavy gold watch clanking loudly against the glass table. "Objection!" Arthur screamed, his face turning bright red. "What is the meaning of this? This line of questioning is entirely out of bounds. I instruct my client not to answer that question. You are fishing for irrelevant personal information, and I will not allow it in this deposition." Lawrence slowly turned his head to look at the screaming lawyer. Then he smiled that cold, dark, predatory smile. He looked down at the state-certified document in his hand and prepared to drop the bomb that would completely obliterate their entire world. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches on the leather briefcase echoed loudly in the freezing conference room. The sound cut right through the heavy silence. Arthur Sterling, the arrogant, opposing lawyer, stopped talking and leaned back in his expensive chair. He looked completely confused. He had spent the last hour trying to break my spirit with insulting questions, and I had given him absolutely nothing but a blank stare. Now the dynamic of the room was shifting rapidly out of his control. Lawrence slowly opened the lid of his briefcase. He did not rush the moment. He moved with the calm, deliberate precision of a surgeon preparing to make a very deep and fatal incision. He reached inside the leather case and pulled out a single thick document. It was heavily stamped with red state certification seals and signed by a superior court judge. Arthur Sterling immediately stood up. His face was flushed bright red with anger. He shouted formal objections and demanded that Lawrence withdraw his previous line of questioning. Lawrence did not withdraw anything. He simply stood there holding the heavy state-certified document. He let Arthur scream until his lungs ran out of air and the room fell silent once again. I watched my ex-wife Vivian reach out with a trembling hand and grab Richard's arm. Her fingernails dug deeply into the fabric of his expensive suit jacket. Her face was pale. She knew exactly what document Lawrence was holding. She knew their massive secret was finally out in the open. Lawrence finally moved. He raised his arm and brought the heavy document down hard against the surface of the glass table. The loud smack echoed like a gunshot in the sterile white room. "Read it," Lawrence commanded. His voice was like low rolling thunder. He looked directly at Arthur Sterling. "Read what your clients have been hiding from you, Arthur." Arthur snatched the paper off the glass table. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. I watched his face transition from pure professional outrage to absolute personal horror in a matter of seconds. Arthur was a deeply arrogant man, but he was not a stupid lawyer. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He looked down at Richard and Maya with an expression of pure professional disgust. "What is this?" Arthur asked, his voice completely hollow and shaking. "You told me this was a simple breach of contract regarding a standard divorce decree. You never mentioned this to me?" Lawrence did not let Richard answer the question. "I will tell you exactly what it is," Lawrence said, stepping forward into the center of the room. That is a decree of adult adoption signed and finalized by a superior court judge exactly 6 months ago. The words hung in the freezing air of the conference room. Adult adoption. I sat perfectly still, but inside my mind the final piece of the puzzle locked firmly into place. My daughter did not just start introducing herself as Maya Kensington at elite country club dinners. She went into a court of law and legally erased me from her existence. Lawrence began to pace slowly behind my chair. His voice filled the room, breaking down the timeline of their massive betrayal. 6 months ago, Maya became officially engaged to Preston Vance, Lawrence explained. The Vance family is old money in this state. They care deeply about lineage and pedigree and pristine social standing. When they looked into Maya's background, they found Julius Holloway. They found a black man who built his life in the dirt and the concrete. They found a man who did not fit into their perfectly curated, aristocratic world. Lawrence paused his pacing and looked directly at Maya. She was staring at the floor, completely broken and unable to move. You panicked. Lawrence continued. You were terrified that Preston's family would cancel the wedding if they knew you came from blue-collar roots. So you and Richard came up with a brilliant legal solution to completely sanitize your background. Richard formally petitioned the court to adopt you as his legal daughter. And because you are an adult over the age of 18, you did not need the consent of your biological father. You simply stood in front of a judge and swore under oath that Richard Kensington was your true parent. I looked at the daughter I raised 6 months ago. I traced my memory back to that exact time. 6 months ago was the Thanksgiving holiday. I remembered calling her to ask if she was coming home to Atlanta for dinner. She told me she was too busy studying for her law exams in Boston. She lied to me. While I was sitting alone at my kitchen table eating a quiet meal, she was standing in a courtroom legally severing her blood ties to me so she could impress a wealthy boy. But you had a massive problem, Lawrence said, turning his sharp attention to Richard. You wanted the prestige of being her legal father, but you were completely bankrupt. You did not have the cash flow to pay her expensive Boston rent or her massive Harvard law tuition. You desperately needed Julius to keep paying the bills. Lawrence leaned over the glass table, resting his heavy weight on his knuckles. So you decided to keep the adoption a complete secret, Lawrence said, his voice dripping with absolute venom. You legally erased Julius Holloway, but you happily kept sending him the massive invoices. You let a 75-year-old man continue to fund the luxury life of a woman who was no longer legally his daughter. You committed textbook financial fraud. Vivian began to cry. It was not a cry of genuine remorse or sadness. It was the desperate, panicked cry of a shallow woman who realizes her entire fake life is about to be burned to the ground. She hid her face in her hands, sobbing loudly into the quiet, sterile room. Arthur Sterling threw the adoption document back onto the glass table as if it were infected with a deadly disease. He backed away from his own client, shaking his head. I cannot represent you, he said directly to Richard. You lied to me during the formal discovery process. You actively concealed a major legal status change. This entire lawsuit is built on a completely fraudulent premise. Arthur began packing his leather briefcase with frantic, nervous energy. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with this massive disaster. He knew that Lawrence was a ruthless attorney, and he did not want his own legal reputation dragged down into the mud along with the Kensington family. But Richard Kensington did not look defeated. In the face of absolute total exposure, Richard did something that proved exactly how deeply arrogant and delusional he truly was. He did not apologize for his actions. He did not drop to his knees and beg for mercy. He sat up straight in his heavy chair, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and smiled. It was a smug, superior smile. He looked at Arthur, and then he looked directly across the glass table at me. He actually believed he was still the smartest man in the room. He believed that his expensive suit and his fake prestige made him absolutely bulletproof against the consequences of his own actions. Sit down, Arthur, Richard commanded, his voice dripping with intense condescension. Stop acting like a panicked child. So what if I adopted her? Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows aggressively on the glass table. He looked right into my eyes. He wanted to show me that he was the ultimate victor in this war. I adopted her because she begged me to do it, Richard said proudly. She came to me crying because she did not want to carry the heavy, embarrassing burden of your low-class name anymore. I did what any real father would do in that situation. I elevated her. I gave her a name that commands instant respect in this city. I gave her the Kensington name. He smiled wider, showing his perfectly white veneered teeth. You can try to paint this as some kind of grand criminal conspiracy, Richard continued, but it changes absolutely nothing about the lawsuit at hand. Richard reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out the folded divorce decree from 16 years ago. He slapped it down onto the glass table right next to the state-certified adoption document. You signed a legally binding contract in the year 2010, Richard said, his voice echoing with absolute triumph. You agreed to pay for her educational expenses until she officially graduated. There is no clause in this divorce decree that says the payments stop if she changes her last name. There is no clause that says the payments stop if she is adopted by a better man. You owe that $65,000 tuition, Holloway. Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms confidently over his chest. He looked like a wealthy king sitting comfortably on his throne. You can bring up all the secret adoption papers you want, he sneered. It does not void your strict financial obligations. You are still legally mandated to pay for her life. And if you do not wire that $85,000 by tomorrow morning, we are going to proceed with this lawsuit and completely destroy your little dirt-covered construction business. I sat there completely silent. I looked at Richard Kensington. He was a man who had built his entire life on exploiting other people. He had exploited Vivian for her massive divorce settlement. He had exploited Maya to take out fraudulent personal loans. He had exploited me for my hard-earned money for years. And even now, caught in a massive lie, he still believed he held the ultimate winning hand. He truly believed that the old piece of paper he was holding was his golden ticket to early retirement. He did not understand the law. He only understood manipulation and intimidation. He thought he could outsmart a man like Lawrence. I did not say a single word in response to his threats. I simply turned my head and looked calmly at my lawyer. Lawrence was standing perfectly still. He was looking at Richard Kensington with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. It was the exact look you give to a foolish man who is standing proudly on a set of train tracks boasting about his immense physical strength, while a massive iron freight train is barreling down right behind him. Lawrence let Richard's smug words hang in the freezing air for a long moment. He let Richard enjoy the absolute peak of his false victory. He let the silence stretch out until the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Then Lawrence smiled. It was a cold, dark smile that did not reach his eyes. The trap was fully sprung. It was time for the final execution. The sterile conference room remained completely silent after Richard Kensington finished his arrogant speech. He was leaning back in his heavy leather chair with his arms crossed over his chest, looking incredibly proud of himself. He truly believed he had won the war. He believed that the wrinkled piece of paper from 16 years ago was an unbreakable shield. He thought he could use a finalized divorce decree to force me to pay for the extravagant lifestyle he could not afford on his own. I did not say a single word. I just sat there looking at the man who had stolen my money and poisoned my daughter's mind. I watched him enjoy the absolute peak of his false victory. Lawrence stood beside me perfectly still. He let Richard's smug words hang in the freezing air of the room for a very long time. He wanted the court reporter to capture every single syllable of Richard's entitled demands. He wanted the official record to show exactly how confident Richard was in his extortion attempt. Then Lawrence smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, calculated smile of an apex predator that had just locked its jaws firmly around the throat of its prey. Lawrence did not look at Richard. He turned his attention directly to Arthur Sterling, the high-priced opposing attorney. Arthur was still standing near the edge of the glass table, looking incredibly nervous. He knew his clients had hidden a massive legal secret from him, but he did not yet understand the full, catastrophic implication of that secret. Lawrence was about to educate him. Counselor Lawrence said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant tone that commanded absolute authority. I am sure a senior partner at a firm as prestigious as yours is intimately familiar with the state family law code. Specifically, I am referring to Title 19, Chapter 8, which governs the absolute legal parameters of adoption within this state. Arthur Sterling swallowed hard. He reached out and opened his sleek silver laptop resting on the glass table. His fingers hovered nervously over the keyboard. Let me refresh your memory just in case. Lawrence continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room. When an adoption is finalized by a superior court judge, it is not simply a cosmetic name change. It is not just a social tool used to impress a wealthy family before a wedding. In the eyes of the law, an adoption is a complete and total rebirth. The law states explicitly that upon the signing of the adoption decree, all legal ties, all parental rights, and most importantly, all financial obligations belonging to the former biological parent are permanently and irrevocably severed. The heavy silence in the room suddenly felt suffocating. I watched the blood begin to drain from Vivian's face. Her hands started to shake so violently that her pearl necklace rattled against her collarbone. She was not a lawyer, but she was a woman who had spent her entire life surviving on the money of other men. She understood the language of financial obligations perfectly. Lawrence turned his head and looked directly at Richard Kensington. The smug, superior smile on Richard's face was beginning to slip. His eyes darted rapidly between Lawrence and his own attorney, trying to figure out what was happening. When you stood in front of that judge 6 months ago, Richard, you did not just give Maya your last name, Lawrence explained, his voice rising slightly to fill the large room. You formally and legally assumed every single responsibility for her existence. You became her father in every legal and financial sense of the word. And by doing so, you completely legally erased Julius Holloway. Lawrence pointed a long finger at the wrinkled divorce decree resting on the glass table. That document you are holding is entirely worthless, Lawrence stated with absolute finality. The child support and educational mandates outlined in that 2010 divorce decree were completely extinguished the very second the judge struck his gavel 6 months ago. Julius Holloway ceased to be Maya's legal father in November. Therefore, the divorce decree is null and void regarding any and all future expenses for Maya Kensington. Maya let out a small, choked gasp. She pressed both of her hands over her mouth, staring at Lawrence with wide, terrified eyes. The reality of her own arrogant decision was finally crashing down on her head. She thought she was being clever by secretly changing her legal identity to secure her position in high society. She had absolutely no idea that she had actively legally disconnected herself from the only bank account that was keeping her afloat. You are demanding $85,000 for breach of contract, Lawrence said, laughing a short, bitter laugh. There is no contract. You cannot breach a legal agreement that no longer exists. Julius Holloway does not owe you $85,000. He does not owe you $65,000 for her law school tuition. He does not owe you a single dime for her extravagant wedding. My client owes you absolutely nothing. Richard Kensington jumped out of his chair. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple. He slammed his manicured hands flat against the glass table. That is a lie, Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. You are twisting the law. That is not how it works. I adopted her, but he is still her biological father. He still has to pay for her school. Richard turned frantically toward his own lawyer. Tell him, Arthur, Richard demanded. Tell him he still has to pay the tuition. Arthur Sterling did not look up. He was staring intensely at the glowing screen of his laptop. His fingers were flying across the keyboard, typing furiously as he accessed the state legal database. He was pulling up the exact statutes Lawrence had just quoted. The blue light from the computer screen reflected off Arthur's pale, sweating face. The entire room waited in agonizing silence while the high-priced lawyer read the law. I watched Arthur's eyes track back and forth across the screen. I watched his shoulders slowly sink. I watched the arrogant, confident posture completely deflate out of his body. He stopped typing. He slowly pulled his hands away from the keyboard and let them fall to his sides. Arthur finally looked up. He did not look at Lawrence. He looked directly at Richard Kensington. His expression was a mixture of absolute defeat and intense professional fury. He is right, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling slightly. No, Richard shouted, pointing an angry finger at his lawyer. You are not looking at the right documents. Look at the divorce decree. I do not need to look at the divorce decree, Arthur snapped back, his voice suddenly rising in anger. The law is absolute, Richard. When you adopted her, you legally absolved Julius Holloway of all prior financial mandates. The prior support orders are completely terminated upon the finalization of the adoption. It is black and white. There is no legal loophole. There is no argument to be made. You severed his obligations the day you signed those papers. Arthur slammed his laptop shut with a loud, aggressive crack. You lied to me, Arthur yelled at Richard and Vivian. You brought me a fraudulent case. You tried to use my law firm to extort money from a man you legally removed from your daughter's life. You have absolutely no legal standing to sue him for tuition. You have no legal standing to sue him for emotional distress. This entire lawsuit is completely dead. The smug, arrogant smile was completely wiped off Richard Kensington's face. It was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward away from the glass table and fell heavily back into his leather chair. His perfectly styled hair was suddenly out of place. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was finally realizing that there was no net waiting to catch him at the bottom. Vivian began to sob uncontrollably, holding her face in her hands. She knew what this meant. She knew they were entirely broke. She knew the creditors were circling their gated mansion and the luxury cars were going to be repossessed. The endless fountain of money she had relied on for 16 years was permanently sealed shut by their own foolish, greedy actions. Maya was hyperventilating. She was gripping the edge of the glass table so hard her fingers looked like they might snap. She looked across the table at me. Her eyes were begging for a lifeline. She was begging for the old Julius Holloway to step in and save her from the disaster she had created. But the old Julius Holloway was dead. I sat there with my hands resting calmly on the table, looking back at her with eyes like cold, flat stones. I felt absolutely nothing for her. Lawrence stood tall in the center of the room. He had just delivered a fatal blow to their entire existence, but he was not finished yet. He looked down at the terrified, broken people sitting across the table. Actually, Lawrence said, his voice cutting through Vivian's loud sobbing, "There is one more extremely important detail regarding the timeline of this adoption." Arthur Sterling looked up, clutching his briefcase. "What else could there possibly be?" Arthur asked, his voice completely exhausted. Lawrence picked up the state-certified adoption decree. "This document proves the adoption was finalized in November," Lawrence explained. "But my client continued to receive tuition invoices from Harvard Law School in his name. In fact, my client paid a $65,000 tuition bill just 3 weeks ago. That means Richard Kensington and Maya Kensington actively concealed her legal identity change for 6 months in order to continue extracting money from my client under false pretenses." Lawrence smiled again, turning his gaze toward the court reporter who was capturing every single devastating word. "That is not just a civil matter," Lawrence stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "That is criminal fraud. But that is still not the worst thing you have done, Richard." I shifted in my seat. I knew exactly what was coming next. The legal reversal of the tuition was just the first bomb. It was the defensive maneuver to protect my assets. But Lawrence and I had agreed the night before that we were not just going to defend ourselves. We were going to completely destroy Richard Kensington. We were going to burn his fake empire down to the ground and salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. Lawrence reached back into his leather briefcase. The trap had snapped shut, but the execution was just beginning. The sterile conference room was completely suffocated by a heavy, dead silence. Richard Kensington was slouched deep into his expensive leather chair, looking like a man who had just been struck by a massive physical blow. His perfect posture was gone. His arrogant confidence was completely shattered by the reality of the adoption decree resting on the glass table. Vivian was weeping loudly into her hands, her heavy pearl necklace shaking violently against her chest. She finally understood that the endless fountain of money she had relied on for 16 years was permanently sealed shut. Maya, my own daughter, was completely frozen. She was staring blankly at the table, her face drained of all color, her breathing shallow and erratic. They thought the execution was over. They thought that losing my money and having their civil lawsuit thrown out was the absolute worst punishment they could possibly endure today. They thought they would simply leave this room humiliated, but free to go back to their gated mansion and figure out a new way to survive. They had absolutely no idea what was actually coming next. I sat up straight into my chair. For the past 2 hours, I had been a silent stone wall. I had let my lawyer Lawrence dismantle their arrogance piece by piece without saying a single word. I had let them insult me and threaten me while I simply watched them dig their own graves. But now the defensive portion of the battle was officially over. It was my turn to drop the final hammer. I looked directly across the glass table into the terrified eyes of Richard Kensington. My voice was low and rough, echoing loudly in the quiet room. "We are not done," I said. The sound of my voice made all three of them physically flinch. Arthur Sterling, the high-priced opposing lawyer, froze with his hand on the handle of his leather briefcase. He had been desperately trying to pack his documents and escape the room to save his own reputation. He stopped moving and looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. He knew that when a quiet man finally speaks, the words are going to be devastating. Lawrence smiled his cold, dark, ruthless smile. He took a step forward and reached back into his own briefcase. He pulled out a second folder. This one was not a standard manila envelope. It was bright, glaring red. He placed it gently on the glass table directly next to the adoption decree. "The civil matter regarding the law school tuition is officially closed," Lawrence announced, his voice perfectly calm and measured. "But unfortunately for you, Richard, my client is not just the victim of a fraudulent civil extortion attempt. He is the primary witness to a massive federal crime." Arthur Sterling slowly let go of his briefcase and lowered himself back into his chair. He wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead. He was no longer just dealing with a fraudulent civil lawsuit. He was sitting in a sealed room with people who were about to be accused of federal felonies. Lawrence opened the red folder. He pulled out a thick stack of dense government forms. 6 months ago, when you legally adopted Maya, your financial situation was already completely ruined, Lawrence explained, looking directly at Richard and Vivian. Your credit was destroyed. The banks had cut you off. You had absolutely no liquid assets, but you still needed to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. You needed to pay for a lavish wedding to impress the Vance family, and you needed to make sure Maya's law school tuition was covered just in case Julius ever figured out the truth and stopped paying. So you decided to ask the federal government for a handout. Lawrence slid the top document across the smooth glass table. It was a free application for federal student aid, commonly known as a FAFSA form. It was signed and dated just a few weeks after the secret adoption was finalized. Let us look at the financial disclosures on this official federal document, Lawrence said, pointing to the specific lines of text with his pen. According to this form, Richard and Vivian Kensington are living in absolute extreme poverty. You declared under the strict penalty of perjury that your total household income was below the poverty line. You claimed you had zero investments, zero savings, and required maximum government assistance so your newly adopted daughter could continue her legal education at Harvard. I watched Maya stare at the government form. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She had signed her name at the very bottom of the page, right next to Richard's signature. She had actively participated in the massive lie. She was studying to be a lawyer, but she had willingly committed perjury on a federal document just to keep up appearances. You begged the government for grants and subsidized loans that are meant for truly desperate, struggling students. Lawrence continued, his voice rising with righteous anger. And the government believed your lies. They approved the application. They sent tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars directly to the university on your behalf. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but he could not form a single word. He was gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. He finally realized that he was not playing a game of family court anymore. He had crossed the line into the jurisdiction of the United States government. But here is the absolute worst part, Richard Lawrence said, lowering his voice to a deadly, razor-sharp whisper. At the exact same time you were telling the federal government that you were completely broke and needed financial aid, you were still actively billing my client for the full $65,000 tuition. You were double-dipping. You were stealing taxpayer money from the Department of Education while simultaneously extorting a blue-collar contractor for the exact same expenses. You took the federal money to pay for your luxury car leases and your country club dues while you expected Julius to pay the actual school. Vivian let out a loud, horrific wail. It was the sound of a woman watching the heavy iron gates of a prison opening up right in front of her. She grabbed Richard's arm, shaking him violently, but Richard was completely catatonic. Maya began to hyperventilate. She clutched her chest, taking short, panicked breaths. She realized in that exact moment that her entire future was completely incinerated. You cannot pass the moral, character, and fitness portion of the state bar exam if you are convicted of defrauding the federal government. She had traded the solid, honest foundation I built for her in exchange for a fake, aristocratic name, and now that name was going to drag her straight into a federal courtroom. We did not just stumble upon these documents yesterday, Lawrence announced, standing tall and victorious at the head of the table. We have had our forensic accountants building this comprehensive file for weeks. We traced every single stolen dollar. We traced the fraudulent personal loans you took out in Maya's name. We traced the federal grants. We have the bank routing numbers, the wire transfers, and the digital signatures. Lawrence paused, letting the absolute terror sink deep into their bones. And we did not keep this information to ourselves, Lawrence stated with absolute terrifying finality. A complete copy of this entire red folder along with the certified adoption decree and the financial extortion demands you served, my client has already been delivered. Arthur Sterling closed his eyes, knowing exactly what Lawrence was going to say next. The documents were sent to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Lawrence said, watching Richard's face turn the color of ash. A secondary copy was sent directly to the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Education. They are currently investigating you for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The execution was complete. The fake empire Richard Kensington had built was not just knocked over, it was burned to the ground and the earth was salted, so nothing could ever grow there again. I looked at the three of them sitting across the table. They looked like ghosts. They had spent the last month treating me like dirt, treating me like an uneducated laborer who could be easily bullied and manipulated. They thought their tailored suits and their expensive zip codes made them untouchable. They thought a man who works with his hands could never outsmart them. They were wrong. I had spent 40 years learning how to build indestructible foundations, but I also knew exactly where to strike to make a corrupt building collapse under its own weight. I did not need to yell. I did not need to throw a temper tantrum. I just needed the truth and the patience to let them destroy themselves. The court reporter stopped typing. The silence in the room was heavier than concrete. The war was over and they had lost absolutely everything. The revelation of the FBI investigation dropped into the center of the conference room like a heavy, concrete block. For a few seconds, nobody moved or breathed. Then the absolute chaos erupted all at once. Vivian Kensington completely lost whatever remaining grip she had on reality. The sophisticated high society facade melted right off her face. She began to scream. It was a loud, piercing sound that echoed violently against the sterile white walls. Her expensive makeup ran down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She gripped the edge of the heavy glass table so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She knew that her life of luxury was completely over. She knew the bank was going to lock the doors to her massive gated mansion, and the leasing companies were coming to tow away her expensive cars. Richard Kensington snapped out of his catatonic state and went into a sudden wild panic. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for a way to escape a burning building. He lunged forward across the glass table. He stretched his arms out desperately, trying to grab the red folder that Lawrence had placed there. He actually believed that if he could just snatch the physical papers, he could somehow stop the federal government from coming after him. It was the pathetic, delusional reaction of a man who was completely broken. Lawrence did not even flinch. He simply reached out with one massive hand and pulled the red folder safely out of Richard's reach. Richard slipped on the smooth glass and collapsed hard against the edge of the table, knocking over a pitcher of ice water. The cold water spilled everywhere, soaking the sleeves of his expensive tailored suit. Arthur Sterling, the high-priced defense attorney, wanted absolutely nothing to do with this disaster. He was shoving his legal pads and his pens into his leather briefcase with frantic, aggressive energy. He was muttering curses under his breath, swearing that he would have Richard disbarred from every country club in Atlanta. He wanted to run out of the building and scrub his hands clean of the entire Kensington family. Right in the middle of this massive screaming panic, the heavy oak door of the conference room suddenly swung open. The loud click of the door handle momentarily cut through the chaos. Everyone turned to look. Standing in the doorway was Preston Vance. Preston had been waiting outside in the luxurious reception area. He was supposed to be the wealthy, confident fiancé waiting patiently while his future father-in-law put the poor, uneducated construction worker back in his place. He had expected Richard to walk out of this room holding a check for $85,000. Instead, he heard the muffled sounds of Vivian screaming and the loud crash of the water pitcher falling over. He stepped into the freezing room looking completely annoyed and confused. He was wearing his crisp pastel polo shirt and his perfectly pressed khaki slacks, looking entirely out of place in a room filled with destroyed lives. "What in the world is going on in here?" Preston demanded. His arrogant voice carried over the sound of Vivian's loud sobbing. He looked at Richard, who was draped over the table with soaking wet sleeves. He looked at Maya, who was sitting completely frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the wall. Then he looked at me. He expected me to be the one causing a scene. He expected me to be yelling and throwing a temper tantrum. Instead, he saw me sitting perfectly calm with my hands folded, resting comfortably in my chair, while his new perfect family completely self-destructed. Richard tried to stand up. He wiped the cold water off his face and forced a terrible fake smile. "It is nothing, Preston." Richard stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Just a minor misunderstanding with the paperwork. We are leaving right now." "Maya, get up. We are leaving." But Arthur Sterling slammed his heavy leather briefcase shut with a loud, violent snap. Arthur was furious that Richard had put his professional law license in jeopardy, and he was not going to let Richard lie his way out of this room. Arthur turned directly to Preston. "It is not a minor misunderstanding," Arthur stated, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "I am officially withdrawing as their legal counsel effective immediately. You need to know exactly who you are marrying into Preston." Preston stepped further into the room, his arrogant smirk completely disappearing. "What are you talking about?" Arthur Preston asked. "What happened to the tuition lawsuit?" "There is no lawsuit," Arthur barked, pointing an angry finger at Richard. "This man is a complete fraud. He does not have a real investment firm. He is entirely broke. He has been living off massive, fraudulent personal loans that he took out in Maya's name. Your beautiful bride is currently drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of toxic debt that she cannot possibly repay." Preston's eyes widened in shock. He looked at Maya. Maya shrank back into her leather chair, completely unable to meet his gaze. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the overwhelming shame. But that is not even the worst part. Arthur continued delivering the final fatal blow. They applied for federal student aid, claiming they were a low-income household living below the poverty line. They stole government funds while simultaneously trying to extort Julius Holloway for the exact same tuition money. The attorney sitting across the table just informed us that he has already submitted the entire evidence file to the authorities. We are talking about federal wire fraud, we are talking about bank fraud, we are talking about bankruptcy and an active investigation by the FBI. The three letters hung in the air like a death sentence, FBI. I watched Preston Vance process the information. I watched the gears turning in his head. The Vance family was built on generations of old money political connections and pristine public image. They spent millions of dollars making sure their family name was associated with elite charities and high society galas. They looked down on people like me because I worked with my hands in the dirt. But they absolutely despised scandal. A poor man was just an inconvenience to them, but a criminal indictment was a deadly virus. Preston realized in that exact moment that he was standing in a room with a family of desperate con artists. He realized that the lavish wedding they were planning was being funded by stolen money and massive credit card debt. He realized that if he married Maya Kensington, his pristine family name would be permanently tied to a federal fraud investigation. His parents would be dragged through the mud in the local newspapers. The society pages would write about how the wealthy Vance heir was tricked into marrying the daughter of a bankrupt criminal. Preston slowly turned his head and looked at Maya. Maya finally found her voice. She stood up from her chair, her legs visibly shaking. "Preston, please," she begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "Preston, it is not what it sounds like. Richard told me he just needed a temporary loan. I did not know about the federal forms. I swear I did not know. We can fix this. Please just listen to me." She reached her hand out across the space between them. She was begging for the wealthy boy to save her from the consequences of her own terrible choices. She had abandoned the solid foundation I built for her because she wanted to live in his golden castle. Now she was desperately clinging to the gates, hoping he would let her inside before the storm washed her away. But Preston Vance did not reach back. He looked at her outstretched hand and then he looked at her face. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was not disappointment. It was absolute, pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at my daughter the exact same way you would look at a piece of rotting garbage you found lying on your expensive living room rug. He saw her for exactly what she was. She was a liability. She was a fraud. She was a woman who was willing to destroy her own biological father for a handful of cash and a fake aristocratic name. And Preston Vance wanted absolutely nothing to do with her. I sat quietly in my chair watching the entire empire crumble into dust. Richard was ruined. Vivian was sobbing, and Maya was staring into the eyes of the man she threw me away for realizing that he was about to throw her away without a single second thought. The destruction was complete, and I had not even raised my voice. Preston Vance stood completely frozen in the doorway of the conference room. He was a man who had been groomed since birth to protect his family legacy at all costs. The Vance name was synonymous with wealth and political power and absolute social purity. They were the kind of people who spent millions of dollars ensuring their public image was entirely flawless. And right now he was looking at the family he was about to join and seeing nothing but a massive criminal liability. He looked at Richard, who was leaning against the table with soaking wet sleeves and a terrified, pale face. He looked at Vivian, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Then his eyes locked onto Maya. Maya was staring back at him with absolute sheer terror in her eyes. She knew exactly what he was thinking. She knew that the elegant, aristocratic illusion she had spent months carefully building was completely shattered into a million pieces. Preston did not yell. He did not curse or throw a frantic temper tantrum like Richard had done earlier. Men born into true generational power do not need to raise their voices to completely destroy someone. Preston simply raised his left hand. He looked down at the heavy gold engagement band resting on his finger. It was a ring that had been in his family for 3 generations. It was a symbol of entry into an elite, exclusive world that Maya had sacrificed her own biological father to join. Preston reached over with his right hand and slowly pulled the ring off his finger. He did not say he was sorry. He looked directly at Maya and told her that the wedding was completely canceled. He spoke in a cold, flat voice, telling her that his family would never associate with federal criminals and bankrupt frauds. He told her she was a complete and absolute embarrassment to his family name. Preston tossed the heavy gold ring onto the smooth glass table. The metal hit the thick glass with a sharp, loud clink that echoed violently in the quiet room. The ring spun around in a small circle before coming to a complete stop right next to the red folder containing the federal evidence. That single piece of jewelry resting next to the evidence of her crimes represented the absolute death of all her arrogant ambitions. Preston did not look back at her. He turned around smoothly and walked out the heavy oak door. His footsteps were calm and measured as he walked down the carpeted hallway toward the elevators. He was walking away from the mess and returning to his pristine, untouched, wealthy life. The sound of the ring hitting the glass finally broke Maya out of her paralyzed state. She let out a desperate, choked sound from the back of her throat. She jumped up from her heavy leather chair so fast that the chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the floor. She did not look at me or her mother or her bankrupt stepfather. She sprinted toward the door. She ran out into the hallway, chasing after the man she thought would be her golden ticket to high society. I sat perfectly still in my chair and listened to the sounds coming from the corridor. I could hear her high heels clicking frantically against the polished marble floors. I could hear her voice echoing down the long hall. She was crying and begging with a desperation I had never heard from her before. She was pleading with him to stop and listen to her. She promised him that she had absolutely no idea about the federal fraud. She swore she would change her legal name back. She begged him not to leave her alone with this massive disaster. Her desperate pleas were met with absolute silence. Preston did not argue with her or offer her any comfort. I heard the quiet, pleasant chime of the elevator arriving on our floor. I heard the heavy metal doors slide open. Maya screamed his name one last time, her voice completely breaking with sheer panic and terror. But the only response was the mechanical sound of the elevator doors sliding shut. He was gone. He had left her standing all alone in a sterile corporate hallway. He had abandoned her exactly like she had abandoned me 6 months ago. It is a very hard and brutal lesson to learn that loyalty bought with a fake identity is not loyalty at all. When you build a relationship on a foundation of lies and manipulation, it collapses the very moment the truth blows in. I sat at the glass table and thought about the absolute reality of Maya's new life. She had woken up this morning as Maya Kensington, the arrogant bride-to-be. She had a $100,000 wedding planned at a botanical garden. She had her expensive law school tuition paid for by a man she deeply despised. She had a wealthy fiancé and a bright, guaranteed future in high society. But in the span of just 2 short hours, every single piece of that fake life had been completely incinerated. She no longer had a wealthy fiancé to protect her from the real world. The wedding was permanently canceled, and she would have to face the humiliation of everyone she knew finding out why. She no longer had the financial support of Julius Holloway because she had legally erased me from her existence. She had absolutely no way to pay for her final year at Harvard Law School. Her academic career was essentially over today, but the absence of those things was not even her biggest problem. Her biggest problem was the desperate, broken man sitting across the table from me. She had legally chosen Richard Kensington to be her father. She had bound herself to a man who was completely bankrupt and ruined. Her own personal credit was entirely destroyed because Richard had taken out hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest loans using her pristine name. The predatory lenders were going to come after her for that money. She would not be able to rent an apartment or buy a car or even get a basic credit card. And hanging over all of this financial ruin was the massive dark shadow of the federal government. She had signed a fraudulent application for federal student aid. She was officially tied to a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States government. She was going to have to hire her own expensive defense attorney just to keep herself out of a federal prison. Law firms conduct deep background checks and moral character evaluations on their new associates. Even if she somehow managed to finish school, no legitimate law firm would ever hire a woman convicted of federal wire fraud. She had traded a man who built a solid, unbreakable foundation for a man who had tied a heavy concrete block around her ankles and pushed her into the deep, dark ocean. A few minutes passed in heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound in the room was Vivian Kensington continuing to cry softly and pathetically into her hands. Richard was staring blankly at the spilled water on the glass table, his mind completely broken by the reality of his own destruction. Then the heavy oak door slowly pushed open. Maya walked back into the conference room. She did not look anything like the arrogant, entitled woman who had sat down at this table 2 hours ago. Her posture was completely shattered. Her shoulders were hunched forward as if she were carrying a massive physical weight. Her hair was messy and her face was deeply stained with dark running makeup and tears. She walked slowly, dragging her feet across the carpet as if every step required a massive amount of physical effort. She looked like a weary survivor crawling out from under the heavy, smoking wreckage of a collapsed building. She walked over to her side of the table and slowly picked up her heavy leather chair from the floor. She sat down heavily, sinking into the leather. She did not look at Richard, the man she had proudly claimed was her true father figure. She did not look at Vivian, her mother, who had dragged her into this shallow, materialistic world. She slowly lifted her head and looked directly across the glass table at me. The fake, aristocratic mask of Maya Kensington was completely gone. Staring back at me was just a broken, terrified little girl who had finally realized the massive, catastrophic scale of her own mistakes. She looked at me with wide, wet eyes that were desperately begging for salvation. She wanted me to fix it. She wanted the old Julius Holloway, the man who had always protected her, to reach into his pocket and pay off the debts and make the bad men go away. She wanted me to tell her that everything was going to be fine, but she was looking at a man who no longer had a daughter. The quiet, unyielding silence between us confirmed that her punishment was absolute and permanent. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Preston Vance, leaving behind a silence so absolute that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. The grand illusion was completely over. There were no more threats to be made and no more legal documents to wave around. Richard Kensington remained slumped over the glass table, his expensive suit ruined by the spilled water, his eyes fixed on nothing at all. He was a man who had finally reached the absolute dead end of his lifelong con. Vivian was still weeping, but her cries had turned into weak, pathetic hiccups. She had spent her life chasing the highest bidder, and now she was permanently tied to a sinking stone. I sat quietly in my chair and watched the dust settle over the ruins of their lives. I did not feel a sense of triumphant joy. I did not feel the urge to stand up and gloat. When you spend your life building things, you understand that demolition is sometimes necessary, but it is never something to celebrate. It is simply the harsh, violent work required before you can pour a clean new foundation. Maya slowly pushed herself up from her heavy leather chair. Her legs were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the glass table just to keep herself standing. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, sophisticated woman who had walked into this legal office 2 hours ago. Her posture was completely broken. Her face was streaked with dark, ruined makeup, and her eyes were swollen and red from crying. She slowly walked around the long glass table, taking small, hesitant steps toward me. She stopped a few feet away from my chair. She looked down at me, and the silence stretched out between us. I looked back at her. I searched my heart for a spark of the old, familiar love I used to carry for her. I searched for the instinct to reach out and pull her into a hug and tell her that I would fix everything. But that part of my heart was completely empty. The fire had been entirely starved of oxygen, and now there were not even any embers left to blow on. She had made sure of that when she signed that sworn affidavit calling me a monster. She began to cry again. It was a deep, agonizing sob. "Dad!" She whispered, her voice cracking and breaking with every single syllable. "Please, I am so sorry. I was stupid and I was blind. I did not know about the federal money. I did not know how bad it was. Please, help me fix this." She reached her hand out toward me, trembling violently. "I will change my name back," she pleaded, the tears falling freely down her face and dripping onto the carpet. "I will go to the courthouse tomorrow. I will be Maya Holloway again. I will do whatever you want. Just please do not leave me here with them. I am so scared. Please, Dad. You are the only one who can help me." I listened to her desperate words. I listened to her offer to trade her legal identity back to me as if it were a cheap piece of clothing she could just return to the store when it no longer fit. She still did not understand the true weight of her actions. She thought my love and my money were things she could just turn back on with a few tears and a hollow apology. She thought the foundation I had built for her was still standing, just waiting for her to come back home. I placed my hands on the armrests of my chair and slowly pushed myself up to a standing position. I am a tall man, broad-shouldered from decades of hard labor, and I towered over her in that freezing room. I looked down into her terrified, weeping eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not show her any anger or bitterness or spite. I looked at her with the absolute chilling emptiness of a stranger. I reached down and slowly buttoned the center button of my dark suit jacket. The movement was calm and deliberate. "I am Julius Holloway," I said, my voice steady and cold, echoing softly in the quiet room. "I do not have a daughter named Kensington." Maya let out a sharp, devastated gasp as if I had just driven a knife directly into her chest. She took a step backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "You made your choice," I continued, looking right through her. "You chose the man you wanted to call your father, you chose the family you wanted to represent, and you chose to sign your name to a document trying to destroy my life for $85,000. I am not a bank, and I am not a backup plan. If you need a lawyer to keep you out of federal prison, I suggest you ask your father for help." I turned away from her completely. I did not wait to hear her response. I did not look back at Vivian or Richard. I looked at Lawrence, my oldest friend and my brilliant attorney. I gave him a single respectful nod. He nodded back, his expression serious and satisfied. The job was done. The structure was leveled. I walked toward the heavy oak door. I opened it and stepped out into the quiet carpeted hallway, leaving them all behind in the freezing meat locker of a conference room. I walked down the corridor and pressed the button for the elevator. The metal doors slid open. I stepped inside and rode the car all the way down to the ground floor. I walked across the polished marble lobby of the downtown high-rise, avoiding the stares of the men in their expensive tailored suits. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped outside. The bright afternoon sun of Atlanta hit my face immediately. The air was thick and humid, carrying the familiar scent of hot asphalt and exhaust fumes. I took a deep, long breath, filling my lungs with the warm southern air. For the first time in an entire month, the heavy, crushing pressure in my chest was completely gone. I felt incredibly light. The parasitic weight that had been draining my energy and my resources for years had finally been cut loose. I walked down the busy street until I reached my dusty, heavy-duty pickup truck. I unlocked the door and climbed up into the cab. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, surrounded by the comforting smells of old leather, dried clay, and black coffee. I reached over and ran my rough, calloused hand across the steering wheel. I had survived Vivian and her greed 16 years ago. I had survived Richard and his extortion today, and I would survive the loss of the daughter I thought I knew. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The heavy engine roared to life with a loud, powerful rumble shaking the entire frame of the truck. I pulled out into the city traffic, leaving the towering glass skyscrapers and the fake corporate world far behind me. I drove east, heading directly toward my commercial construction site. I had a crew of 30 men waiting for me. We had a massive concrete foundation to pour before the sun went down. The world was still turning, and there was still honest work to be done. I drove through the streets of the city I helped build, ready to start a brand new chapter of my life, entirely on my own terms. The storm had passed. The toxic debris had been cleared away. The ground was finally solid again. Order was completely restored. If there is one thing this entire ordeal has taught me, it is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional financial support. We spend our lives breaking our backs to build a solid foundation for our children, hoping they will stand on it and reach the sky. But when they take that foundation and use it to crush you, you have to be willing to tear the whole building down. Family is not just a shared name or a bloodline. Family is built on mutual respect and genuine loyalty. I learned that you cannot buy true respect, and you should never finance your own disrespect. Please let me know in the comments below how you would have handled this situation. Do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with anyone who needs a reminder to stand up for their own worth. See you in the next video.